Some losses never truly heal. They just learn to live quietly inside us. For 40 years, Clara Boone carried the weight of her brother's disappearance like a stone in her chest, walking the Montana mountains alone with questions that had no answers. Then one cold November morning, a bleeding horse appeared at her door. Clara followed its trail deep into the forest, where she found an old cabin hidden beneath years of overgrowth. Inside, buried under rotting floorboards, was a leather journal written in her brother's hand. The words on those pages would change everything she believed about the day he vanished. What secret had he been keeping all those years? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains had been Clara Boone's constant companions for 62 years. And in the last 40, they had been her only true friends. She woke each morning in the same log house where she'd been born, where her parents had raised her and Daniel, where the walls still held the echoes of a family that no longer existed. The house sat on 20 acres of pine and aspen, at the end of a gravel road that most folks in Timber Ridge had forgotten even existed. Clara's morning routine never varied. She rose at first light, built a fire in the wood stove, made coffee in the same blue enamel pot her mother had used, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun climb over the eastern peaks. The view hadn't changed in all those years, and she found comfort in that constancy. The world beyond these mountains might rush forward with its technology and noise, but here, time moved at the pace of seasons and the slow growth of trees. After coffee, she would pull on her worn boots, grab her hand-carved walking stick, the one marked with notches for each year since Daniel vanished, and head out into the forest. Walking had become both meditation and penance. Each step was a prayer she didn't know how to voice. Each path a search for something she'd long ago accepted she would never find. The people in Timber Ridge called her the woman who walks alone. She'd heard the whisper more than once, usually followed by a pitying shake of the head. They meant it kindly, she supposed, but it still stung. They saw her as tragic, frozen in grief, unable to move forward. What they didn't understand was that she had moved forward, just in a different direction than they expected. She'd learned to live with absence the way others lived with chronic pain. Something always present but manageable if you learned the right way to carry it. Old Sam at the general store was one of the few who treated her normally. She stopped by every Thursday for supplies, and he'd greet her with the same gruff warmth he showed everyone. He was 78 now, had known her parents, had known Daniel. Sometimes she caught him looking at her with something like understanding in his weathered face, as if he too knew what it meant to carry the weight of the past. "How's the solitude treating you, Clara?" he'd ask, ringing up her flour and coffee and canned goods. "Same as always, Sam. Quiet suits me." "Nothing wrong with quiet," he'd agree, bagging her items with careful hands. "Long as it's the kind you choose." She always wondered if he suspected hers wasn't entirely chosen, but he never pressed. Ruth Callahan was another matter. They'd been close once, best friends through childhood and into their 20s. But after Daniel disappeared, after Clara's brief, failed marriage to a man from Billings who couldn't understand why she needed to come back to these mountains, after Clara had retreated more and more into herself, their friendship had withered. Ruth had tried. Clara would give her that. She'd invited Clara to church socials and book clubs and Christmas dinners. But Clara couldn't bear the pitying glances, the careful way people spoke around her, as if mentioning hiking or hunting or even the forest itself might shatter her. These days, they exchanged polite nods in town, nothing more. Ruth had become the elementary school principal, married a good man, raised 3 children who'd all moved to bigger cities. She had the life Clara might have had. In another version of events, Pastor Henley at the Methodist Church was kind in his distant way. He'd presided over her parents' funerals, first her mother, who died of a broken heart disguised as pneumonia 3 years after Daniel vanished. Then her father, who'd followed less than a year later, his body simply giving up without his wife and son. The pastor had tried to comfort Clara with words about God's plan and eternal reunion, but she'd stopped attending services shortly after. If there was a God, She figured he had his reasons for taking her family, and she had her reasons for keeping her distance. Daniel. Even after 40 years, his name still caught in her throat like a bone. He'd been 24 when he disappeared, 2 years older than Clara, tall and strong, with their father's dark hair and their mother's gentle eyes. He'd loved these mountains more than anyone she'd ever known, could track a deer through stone and read the weather in the shape of clouds. When he'd said he was going on a hunting trip that October morning in 1985, she'd kissed his cheek and told him to be safe. The same way she always did, he never came home. The search had lasted 3 weeks. Rangers, volunteers, tracking dogs, even a helicopter from the state police. They'd combed thousands of acres, followed every lead, checked every cabin and cave and gulch. Nothing, no body, no blood, no sign of struggle or accident. It was as if the forest had simply opened and swallowed him whole. The official conclusion was that he'd fallen into a ravine or been caught in an early snowstorm and died of exposure. His body, they said, would likely never be found. The mountains kept their secrets. Clara's mother had wanted to hold a funeral anyway, to have something to mourn over, but Clara had refused. Without a body, without proof, some part of her couldn't accept he was truly gone. She'd been 22 then, engaged to a ranch hand named Michael, who'd promised her a good life. But after Daniel vanished, she couldn't focus on wedding plans, or future children, or anything beyond the terrible absence that had opened in her world. Michael had been patient for a while, then less patient, then gone. She couldn't blame him. She'd been half alive herself, going through motions, unable to imagine joy when Daniel was missing. The years had passed in a strange blur. She'd worked odd jobs, cleaning houses, helping with harvests, doing bookkeeping for local businesses. She'd inherited the family land when her father died, and by then she'd known she would never leave it. This was where Daniel had last been. This was where he might someday return, if miracles existed. She'd learned self-sufficiency through necessity and pride. She kept a large garden, hunted deer and elk for meat, cut her own firewood, fixed what broke, and accepted that loneliness was simply the shape her life had taken. Some people were meant for family and community. Others were meant for solitude and silence. She'd made her peace with being the latter, or so she'd told herself, through 40 long winters. The morning the horse appeared started like any other. November had arrived with its particular brand of cold, the kind that made her breath visible and turned the ground hard as iron. Clara had been splitting wood behind the house, her axe rising and falling in steady rhythm. When she'd heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a huffing, labored breathing that spoke of pain and exhaustion. She turned, axe lowering, and there it was. A horse, dark bay with a white star on its forehead, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was saddled, but riderless, and even from a distance she could see it was injured. Blood matted its right shoulder, dripping slowly onto the frozen ground. Clara set down the axe and approached slowly, hands visible, voice low and calm. "Easy now, easy." The horse watched her with dark, intelligent eyes. It didn't bolt or shy away, just stood there trembling, as if it had come specifically to find her. She'd seen enough injured animals to know this one had been hurt recently. The blood was still fresh, the wound deep enough to be serious but not immediately fatal. She'd grabbed her first aid supplies and managed to clean and bandage the shoulder, a gash that looked like it had come from a broken branch or perhaps barbed wire. The horse stood patiently through her ministrations, though she could feel its muscles quivering with pain and exhaustion. "Where did you come from?" She'd murmured, checking for brands or identification. Nothing, no markings, no tags on the saddle. The tack was old but well-maintained, the kind someone used regularly rather than for show. She'd led the horse to her small barn, given it water and feed, made sure the wound was properly dressed. It drank deeply but refused the hay, just stood there watching her with those knowing eyes. "You need rest," she told it, but even as she said it, she knew something was wrong. The horse wasn't settling. It kept moving to the barn door, looking out toward the forest, then back at her. Insistent, purposeful, Clara had seen animals do strange things over the years. She'd watched a raven lead her to an injured fawn once, had seen a dog refuse to leave its dead owner's side for 3 days. Animals had their own intelligence, their own ways of communicating need. This horse was trying to tell her something. She'd argued with herself for 10 minutes, standing in the barn with her arms crossed, practical sense warring with intuition. Following a wounded horse into the forest as winter approached was foolish. She had work to do, wood to finish splitting, supplies to organize before the heavy snows came. But the horse kept watching her, and something in its gaze reminded her of Daniel. The same determination, the same quiet insistence that something important needed doing. Finally, Clara had given in to the pull she'd been feeling. She'd packed a small bag, water, some food, matches, her knife, a flashlight, though it was only mid-morning. She'd pulled on her heavy coat, grabbed her walking stick, and opened the barn door. The horse had walked out immediately, not toward the road but toward the forest, toward the deep woods that even Clara, who'd walked these mountains for 40 years, rarely ventured into. She'd followed, her boots crunching on frozen ground, watching the blood trail the horse left behind, dark drops that stood out against fallen leaves and pine needles. The animal moved with purpose despite its injury, taking paths Clara half recognized and others she didn't know existed. An hour passed, then 2. They climbed higher, the air growing thinner and colder. The horse never hesitated, never paused, except to glance back and make sure Clara was still following. The blood trail continued, a crimson thread leading them deeper into wilderness. Clara's legs burned with the climb, her breath coming harder. She was 62 and fit from her daily walks, but this was different, steeper, more demanding. Still she followed, because something told her this mattered, that wherever this horse was leading her, she needed to go. The sun was high overhead when the landscape changed. They'd entered a section of forest Clara didn't recognize, though she'd have sworn she knew every acre within a day's walk of her home. Old growth here, trees that had stood for centuries, their trunks thick and bark deeply grooved. The undergrowth was dense with ferns and wild berry bushes, and she had to push through branches that caught at her coat. Then the horse stopped. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, sides heaving, and looked directly at Clara. Then it turned and looked at something else, a cabin. Clara's heart stuttered in her chest. The structure was small, maybe 12 feet square, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to gray. It was nearly invisible, covered in creeping vines and moss, surrounded by decades of growth that had almost reclaimed it for the forest. If she hadn't been standing right here, if the horse hadn't led her directly to it, she never would have seen it. She approached slowly, her walking stick suddenly feeling like a weapon she might need. The cabin had a single door and one small window, both intact but aged. The roof, surprisingly, looked solid. Someone had shingled it with care. Someone had built this place to last and to hide. As Clara got closer, she noticed details that made her breath catch. The notching on the logs, the particular way the corners were joined. She knew that style. Her father had taught both her and Daniel to build that way, the old Scandinavian method their grandfather had brought from Norway. Daniel had built this cabin. Her hand shook as she reached for the door. There was a padlock, rusted but still in place, holding a hasp someone had mounted carefully. She looked around and found a heavy rock, used it to break the corroded lock with 3 sharp strikes that echoed through the quiet forest. The door swung open with a groan of old hinges, and Clara stepped inside. The air inside was cold but dry, preserved by the mountain's particular climate. Thin light filtered through the single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in Clara's wake. Her eyes adjusted slowly, and what she saw made her knees weak. The cabin was small but carefully organized. A narrow cot stood against one wall, its blankets still tucked military tight. A small wood stove sat in the corner, cold and dark but clean. Shelves lined another wall, holding canned goods that had long since expired. A few tin cups, a plate. Personal items were arranged with precision. A razor, a bar of soap, a comb. Someone had lived here. Not just survived, but lived with intention and care. Clara's gaze swept the space, cataloguing everything, her mind trying to make sense of what she was seeing. And then she saw it on the small table near the window, a leather-bound book, its cover dark with age and oil from human hands. She crossed the space in 3 steps and picked it up, her fingers trembling. The leather was soft, well-worn, and when she opened it, she saw handwriting that sent a shock through her entire body. Daniel's handwriting. She'd have known it anywhere. The particular slant of his letters, the way he crossed his T's with a flourish, the careful precision of his words. She'd helped him with his homework as children, had received letters from him when he'd gone to work on a ranch 2 counties over one summer. This was his hand, as familiar to her as her own. The first page was dated October 18th, 1985, 3 days after he'd left for his hunting trip. 3 days into the search that had torn apart their family and the entire community. Clara sank onto the cot, the journal clutched in both hands, and began to read. I'm writing this because I need someone to know the truth, even if that someone is only me. I'm not lost. I'm not dead. I'm here by choice, though choice is probably the wrong word for what happened. I'm here because it was the only way to keep her safe. Her. Clara's breath caught. Who was her? I should start at the beginning, but I don't know where that is anymore. When did I fall in love with Elizabeth Garrett? Was it the first time I saw her at the harvest dance, her yellow dress spinning under the lanterns? Or was it later, when we talked by the river and she told me she felt trapped in her own life? Maybe it doesn't matter when it started. What matters is that it happened, and now I'm paying the price. Elizabeth Garrett. The name struck Clara like a physical blow. She knew that name. Everyone in the county knew the Garretts. They owned half the timberland, ran the largest ranch, had money and influence that stretched to the state capital. Thomas Garrett, the eldest son, had married someone around that time. Clara tried to remember, her mind racing back through 40 years of half-forgotten gossip and society announcements. Yes, Thomas Garrett had married a woman named Elizabeth in the fall of 1985, right around the time Daniel had disappeared. Clara had been too consumed with grief to pay attention to society weddings, but she remembered her mother mentioning it. The way small-town mothers noted when wealthy families married off their children. She kept reading, her heart pounding. Elizabeth and I met in secret for 6 months. She knew her parents had promised her to Thomas, knew that refusing would bring shame and financial ruin to her family. But she loved me. God help us both, she loved me, and I loved her with everything I had. We made plans to run away together, to start over somewhere her family's name meant nothing. We were young and stupid enough to believe love was enough. Clara's hands shook as she turned the page. Outside she could hear the horse moving, its hooves scraping against earth. The sound felt distant, unreal. Everything felt unreal except the words in front of her. Thomas found out. I don't know how. Maybe we were careless. Maybe someone saw us together. 2 days before Elizabeth and I were supposed to leave, his father came to me. Not Thomas. His father, Marcus Garrett, who had built that family fortune with ruthlessness everyone whispered about, but no one dared confront. He gave me a choice, though calling it a choice is generous. Clara could barely breathe as she read what came next. He said if I stayed, if I tried to be with Elizabeth, he would destroy my family. He would bring charges against Dad, false ones about timber theft, about poaching on Garrett land. He had judges and lawyers and law enforcement in his pocket. He could make those charges stick, could put Dad in prison, could take our land, could ruin everything Mom and Dad had built. And Elizabeth, he said if she refused to marry Thomas, her father would lose everything. Garrett held his debt, could call it in any time. Her whole family would be out on the street. The cruelty of it stole Clara's breath. 2 families held hostage. 2 lives destroyed to preserve one family's pride and power. Marcus gave me 24 hours to decide. Leave forever, make it look like an accident or getting lost, and everyone I loved would be safe. Stay, and everyone I loved would suffer. I spent that night walking these mountains, trying to find another answer. There wasn't one. Love meant nothing against that kind of power. So I chose exile. I chose to protect them, my parents, my sister Elizabeth. I chose to become a ghost. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, hot and bitter. All those years, all that grief. Their mother had died believing Daniel was dead, her heart broken by loss that was really sacrifice. Their father had followed, destroyed by the same lie. And she, Clara, had spent 40 years mourning a brother who'd been alive, who'd been so close, who'd given up everything to protect them. She turned pages with shaking hands, reading more. The next entries described Daniel's first days in hiding, building this cabin in secret, learning to live like a shadow in the forest he'd always loved. He described watching his own funeral service from a distance, seeing his family's grief, knowing he'd caused it, and being unable to ease it. I see Clara walking sometimes, one entry read, dated 6 months after his disappearance. She takes the trail near Moose Creek, the one we used to hike together. She walks slowly now, like the weight of the world is on her shoulders. I want to call out to her, to tell her I'm alive, to explain, but I can't. If they know I'm here, if anyone knows, Marcus Garrett will make good on his threats. I have to stay dead. I have to let them grieve. It's the only way to keep them safe. Clara sobbed, deep, wrenching sounds that came from somewhere. Beyond tears, beyond grief. This was anguish, mixed with rage, mixed with a love so profound it hurt. Her brother had loved them enough to die to the world, and the Garretts had let it happen, had built their perfect life on the foundation of his sacrifice. She forced herself to keep reading. The entries became less frequent as years passed. Daniel described the seasons changing, animals he observed, the way the forest looked in different lights. He wrote about Elizabeth too, watching her from a distance, seeing her in town occasionally, noting how her smile had faded, how she moved through her life like a ghost herself. I saw her today, one entry from 1990 read. She was at the market with a little girl, maybe 4 years old. Her daughter, Elizabeth, looked thin, tired. She wore expensive clothes, but carried herself like they were a burden. I wanted to go to her, to tell her I kept my promise, that I protected her the only way I could. But what good would it do? She's made a life. She's a mother. I'm just a man who loved her once and couldn't keep her. I'm nobody now. A ghost watching the living from the trees. The later entries were sparse, sometimes years apart. Daniel wrote about getting sick once, nearly dying from fever, but pulling through alone. He described the loneliness as a physical thing, a presence that lived with him in the cabin. He wrote less and less about Elizabeth, as if even the act of writing her name had become too painful. The final entry was dated 12 years ago. Winter's coming early this year. I can feel it in my bones, which are getting old and tired. I'm 56 now, though I stopped keeping precise track somewhere along the way. Time doesn't mean much when you're outside of it. I think about death more these days. Not in a sad way, just practical. When I die, will anyone find me? Will Clara ever know what happened? I think I'd like her to know. She deserved better than the grief I gave her. If anyone finds this journal, find my sister Clara Boone. Tell her I loved her. Tell her I'm sorry. And find Elizabeth. Tell her I kept my promise. Tell her I never stopped loving her. Tell her it was worth it, even though it broke me. Love was worth it. Clara sat in the silent cabin holding her brother's final words, and something inside her that had been frozen for 40 years finally cracked open. The grief poured out, not the numb acceptance she'd carried for decades, but raw, fresh agony. She cried for Daniel's sacrifice, for their parents who'd died without knowing the truth, for Elizabeth who'd been forced into a loveless marriage. For all the years stolen by one family's cruelty and power. When the tears finally subsided, she was left with something else, a cold, clear anger and a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in decades. She stood, wiping her face with her sleeve, and looked around the cabin with new eyes. This was sacred ground. This was where her brother had chosen to live out his exile, rather than bring harm to those he loved. She wouldn't let his sacrifice be forgotten. Clara carefully closed the journal and held it to her chest. Then she began to search the cabin more thoroughly. In a wooden box under the cot, she found photographs, some of Daniel as a young man, a few of their family, and several of a beautiful young woman with dark hair and sad eyes. Elizabeth, she assumed. There was also a small silver locket on a delicate chain. She opened it carefully. Inside was a lock of dark hair and a tiny inscription, "Forever despite everything." Clara pocketed the locket and gathered the photographs. The journal went into her pack, wrapped carefully in a spare shirt to protect it. She took one last look around the cabin, committing every detail to memory. Outside, the horse was gone. It had led her here and then vanished, its purpose fulfilled. Clara didn't question it. She'd long ago accepted that the mountains worked in ways beyond human understanding. The walk back to her homestead took 3 hours, the sun sinking toward the western peaks as she hiked. Her mind spun with questions. What had happened to Daniel after that last entry? Had he died here in the cabin or somewhere else in the forest? And Elizabeth, was she still alive? Still trapped in her marriage to Thomas Garrett? Clara needed answers. More than that, she needed to honor her brother's final request. Find Elizabeth. Tell her Daniel had kept his promise. By the time Clara reached her house, night had fallen and the temperature had dropped below freezing. She built up the fire, made coffee she didn't drink, and sat at her kitchen table with the journal open in front of her. She had spent 40 years walking away from the past. Now she was going to walk straight into it, no matter the cost. The Garretts had taken her brother's life, had stolen his future, and condemned him to exile. They thought they'd gotten away with it, that their power meant they'd never face consequences. They were wrong. Clara Boone was going to make sure the truth came out, even if it meant facing down the most powerful family in the county, even if it meant dredging up pain that had calcified into something she'd learned to live with. Even if it meant risking the quiet life she'd built from the ruins of her grief. Daniel had sacrificed everything for love. The least she could do was make sure that sacrifice meant something. She pulled out a notepad and began to write, organizing her thoughts, making a plan. First, she needed to know if Elizabeth was still alive. Then she needed to understand the full scope of what the Garretts had done. And finally, she needed to decide how to deliver Daniel's message, and whether to expose the truth publicly or privately. The answers wouldn't come easy. But Clara had spent 40 years in the wilderness of grief. She knew how to be patient. She knew how to track. She knew how to survive when the path ahead was unclear. And now, for the first time in 4 decades, she had a purpose beyond simple survival. She had a promise to keep. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table reading and rereading Daniel's journal by lamplight, each pass revealing new details she'd missed before, new layers of pain and sacrifice that cut deeper than the last. Around 3 in the morning, she found what she'd been looking for, tucked between 2 pages near the middle of the journal, a photograph she'd missed during her first frantic reading. It showed Daniel and a young woman sitting on a riverbank, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. The woman was beautiful in an unassuming way. Dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, eyes that sparkled with genuine joy, a smile that transformed her entire face. On the back, in Daniel's careful handwriting, "Elizabeth and me, July 1985, the day I knew." Clara studied the woman's face, memorizing every detail. This was the person her brother had loved enough to give up everything for. This was the person who'd been forced to marry Thomas Garrett while Daniel watched from the shadows. Helpless to intervene, she set the photograph aside and returned to the journal, reading the entries from that summer of 1985 with new understanding. Daniel described meeting Elizabeth at a community dance, the way she'd looked uncomfortable in the formal dress her mother had insisted she wear. He'd asked her to dance out of politeness, he wrote, but within minutes he'd been captivated. She talked about wanting to study botany, one entry read. She knew the name of every wildflower in these mountains, could tell you their properties and growing seasons. She said plants made sense to her in a way people didn't. I understood that completely. They'd started meeting in secret after that first dance. The river spot in the photograph became their place, hidden from the road by a thick stand of willows. Elizabeth would tell her parents she was going sketching, which was true enough, Daniel noted. She'd bring her pad and draw plants, while they talked about everything and nothing. Today, she told me she was engaged to Thomas Garrett, Daniel had written in late August. She said it like someone announcing a death sentence. Her parents arranged it. Some debt her father owed to the Garrett family, some business deal that required sealing with a marriage. She was crying and I held her, and I knew I loved her. I knew I'd do anything to save her from that life. Clara's throat tightened reading those words. Young love, pure and uncomplicated, running headlong into the reality of power and money and family obligation. It was a story as old as time, but knowing how it ended, knowing her brother had spent decades in exile, knowing Elizabeth had been trapped in a marriage she didn't want, made it unbearably tragic. She forced herself to keep reading through the entries that described their plan to run away together. They were going to head to Oregon, Daniel wrote. He had a friend from the army who'd offered him ranch work there, far enough from Montana that the Garrett family's influence wouldn't reach. They'd planned to leave on October 20th, before the wedding scheduled for November 2nd, but Marcus Garrett had found out. The entry from October 15th described the meeting with a level of detail that made Clara's hands shake with anger. He called me to his office in town, Daniel wrote. Made me wait an hour before seeing me. Power play, making sure I understood my place. When I finally got in, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He knew everything, every meeting Elizabeth and I had, every word of our plan. He'd had us followed, he said, had people watching us for weeks. He laid it out cold and clear. If I tried to take Elizabeth, my family would pay. Dad would be arrested for timber theft. Marcus already had false evidence prepared. Mom would lose the house, the land, everything. Clara would be left with nothing. And Elizabeth's family? Her father's business would be ruined. Her mother's reputation destroyed. He had the power to do all of it, and he made sure I knew he would. Clara set down the journal and walked to the window. Dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of grey and pale orange. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, trying to steady her breathing. Marcus Garrett was dead now, had been for nearly 20 years. But his son Thomas still lived. Thomas, who'd married Elizabeth knowing she loved someone else. Thomas, who'd benefited from his father's cruelty and never once thought to question it or make amends. The anger that had been building in Clara since yesterday crystallized into something hard and purposeful. She was going to find out what had happened to Elizabeth. And if Elizabeth was still alive, still trapped in that family, Clara was going to tell her the truth, that Daniel had loved her, had sacrificed everything for her, had kept his promise even though it had cost him his life. As morning light filled her kitchen, Clara made coffee and began to formulate a plan. First, she needed information. She couldn't just walk up to the Garrett estate and demand to see Elizabeth, assuming Elizabeth was even still alive. She needed to be smart about this, careful. She thought about who might have information. Old Sam at the general store had been in Timber Ridge his whole life. He might know something about the Garrett family's private affairs. But Sam was also careful about gossip, especially about the wealthy families who could make trouble. Ruth, though. Ruth had connections. Clara didn't. She'd been a teacher, had worked at various schools in the county. She might know more about the Garretts than she'd ever had reason to share. Clara made her decision. She'd go to town today, stop by Sam's store like always, see what she could learn without asking direct questions. Then, if necessary, she'd swallow her pride and approach Ruth. She showered and dressed carefully, choosing clean jeans and a wool sweater her mother had knitted decades ago. The journal went into her truck, hidden under the front seat. The photograph and locket she kept in her jacket pocket, close to her heart. The drive to Timber Ridge took 30 minutes on the winding mountain road. The town hadn't changed much over the years. Still the same main street with its handful of businesses, the same church with the white steeple, the same sense that time moved differently here than in the rest of the world. Sam's general store occupied the corner of Main and First, a wooden building that had stood there for over 100 years. The bell above the door chimed as Clara entered, and Sam looked up from behind the counter. "Clara," he greeted her with his usual nod. Wasn't expecting you until Thursday. Needed a few things, she said, grabbing a basket and wandering the aisles. She picked up items randomly, canned soup, matches, a bag of flour, while her mind worked on how to bring up the Garretts without raising suspicion. She brought her items to the counter, and Sam rang them up with practiced efficiency. As he bagged her purchases, she said casually, "Saw a nice horse up near my property yesterday. Dark bay with a white star. You hear about anyone losing one?" Sam paused, considering. "Can't say I have." "You check for brands?" "Nothing. Thought maybe it came from one of the big ranches." "Could be. The Garrett place has horses, but they keep good track of their stock." He handed her the bag. "You might call up there, ask, the Garretts still running that ranch?" Clara asked, keeping her tone neutral. "I heard Thomas Garrett took over after his father passed." "That's right. Old Marcus died, must be 19 years ago now. Thomas runs everything now. Doesn't come to town much, though. Keeps to himself up on that estate. He married, isn't he? I seem to remember a wedding around the time my brother—" She let her voice trail off, as if the memory was too painful to complete. Sam's expression softened. "Yes, he married Elizabeth Finch. That would have been 1985, same autumn Daniel went missing. I remember because your mama couldn't attend the wedding. She was too torn up about the search." "Elizabeth," Clara repeated, committing the maiden name to memory. "She's still living up there?" Sam's face clouded slightly. "I believe so, though like I said, the Garretts don't come to town much. Elizabeth used to years back. She'd come in for supplies sometimes, always real polite. But I haven't seen her in, must be 5 years or more. 5 years. That was a long time to not come to town, even for someone wealthy enough to have everything delivered." "She doing all right?" Clara asked. "Just curious. I don't remember much from that time, but I recall she seemed nice." Sam's expression turned careful, the way it did when he was choosing his words. "Can't say I know much about the private affairs up at the Garrett place. Clara, they keep their business to themselves. And folks around here have learned not to pry." There was something in the way he said it, a warning maybe, or just the acknowledgement of how things worked when you lived under the shadow of a powerful family. Clara nodded and paid for her purchases. As she turned to leave, Sam called after her, "Clara, that horse shows up again, you let me know. Might be it wandered from somewhere else, but I'll make some calls. Check around." "Thanks, Sam." Outside, Clara loaded her purchases into the truck but didn't start the engine. She sat there thinking. Sam had told her what he could, without saying anything directly. The Garretts were private, powerful, and people didn't ask questions about them. Elizabeth was alive, or had been 5 years ago, but hadn't been seen in town for a long time. That could mean anything or nothing. But Clara's instincts, honed by 40 years of reading the forest and its signs, told her it meant something. She looked down the street toward the Methodist church and, beyond it, the elementary school where Ruth worked. It was Saturday, so Ruth wouldn't be there. But Clara knew where she lived, a small Victorian house 2 streets over that Ruth had inherited from her parents. Clara started the truck, but instead of heading home, she drove through town to Maple Street. Ruth's house was painted pale blue with white trim, a tidy garden in front, even this late in the season. Her car sat in the driveway. Clara almost kept driving. The years of distance between them felt insurmountable, and pride was a hard thing to swallow. But Daniel's words echoed in her mind. "Find Elizabeth. Tell her I kept my promise." She parked and walked to the front door before she could change her mind, knocked 3 times, and waited. Ruth answered, wearing gardening gloves and an expression of surprise that quickly became wariness. "Clara!" "Ruth, I know it's been a long time, but I need to talk to you about something. It's important." Ruth studied her for a long moment, and Clara could see her weighing curiosity against old hurt, present caution against past friendship. Finally she stepped back. "Come in." The house was warm and inviting, filled with books and photographs of Ruth's children and grandchildren. She led Clara to the kitchen, offered coffee, and they sat across from each other at a wooden table that bore the marks of family meals and homework sessions. "What's this about?" Ruth asked directly. Clara took a breath. "The Garrett family. Thomas and Elizabeth specifically." Ruth's expression closed immediately. "Why are you asking about them?" "Because," Clara said carefully. "I found something. Something that connects to my brother, to Daniel. And I need to know about Elizabeth Garrett." "Clara, the Garretts are—" Ruth stopped, seemed to reconsider. "What did you find?" Clara pulled out the photograph, the one of Daniel and Elizabeth by the river, and slid it across the table. Ruth picked it up, her eyes widening. "Where did you get this?" "I can't tell you everything yet," Clara said. "But I need to know. Is Elizabeth still alive? Is she all right?" Ruth set down the photograph with shaking hands. "I don't. Clara, this is complicated. Please, whatever you know, I need to hear it." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the photo. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "I worked at the Garrett estate for 2 years, teaching their daughter. This was, 15 years ago now. I saw Elizabeth regularly during that time. And she was one of the saddest women I've ever met," Ruth said quietly. "Beautiful, elegant, everything money could buy. And absolutely miserable. She barely spoke, moved through that big house like a ghost. Thomas, he wasn't cruel in any obvious way, but he was cold. Controlled everything, everyone. Elizabeth had no freedom, no life outside that estate." Clara's heart clenched. "Did she ever talk about being unhappy?" "Once," Ruth said. "Near the end of my time there. We were in the garden. She loved the garden, spent hours there every day. I asked her something innocent, about whether she'd always lived in Montana. And she said, I was going to leave once. I was going to run away with someone and start over. Then she looked at me with these terribly sad eyes and said, but some choices get made for us, don't they? Did you ask who she was going to run away with? No, it felt too private, too painful. And honestly, I was afraid of knowing. The Garretts, they have power, Clara, real power. I was let go not long after that conversation. No explanation, just told my services were no longer needed. Clara absorbed this, feeling the weight of confirmation. Elizabeth had remembered Daniel, had carried that loss all these years. Is she still alive? Clara asked again. Ruth nodded slowly. As far as I know. But Clara, if you're thinking of approaching her, I have to, Clara said firmly. I have something she needs to see. Something from Daniel. Ruth's eyes widened. From Daniel? But he's been gone for... I know how long he's been gone, Clara said. But I found something. Ruth, something that changes everything I thought I knew about the day he disappeared. What did you find? Clara hesitated, then decided Ruth deserved to know at least part of the truth. Evidence that he didn't just disappear, that he left to protect people he loved. And one of those people was Elizabeth Garrett. Ruth stared at her. Are you saying, I'm saying my brother and Elizabeth were in love, and Marcus Garrett made sure they could never be together. He threatened Daniel, threatened our family, threatened hers. Daniel chose exile to keep everyone safe. Oh, Clara. Ruth's hand covered her mouth. All these years he was alive, living in the forest, watching over her from a distance, and she never knew. She thought he'd abandoned her, or died, or just disappeared. But he kept his promise. He stayed away to protect her. Tears rolled down Ruth's cheeks. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. It is, Clara agreed. But now I need to tell her the truth. She deserves to know that Daniel loved her, that he sacrificed everything for her. Can you help me reach her? Ruth wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. Thomas goes to the city for business regularly. Twice a month, usually gone for 2 or 3 days. Elizabeth walks the estate gardens every morning at dawn. She's done that for as long as I've known of her. If you wanted to approach her, that would be the time. When Thomas is gone and she's alone, when is he next traveling? I don't know his schedule anymore, Clara, but... Ruth stood and went to a drawer, pulled out an old address book. She flipped through it and wrote something on a piece of paper. This is someone who might know. Sarah Mitchell. She used to be Sarah Garrett, Thomas and Elizabeth's daughter. She left home as soon as she turned 18, moved to Oregon. We corresponded for a few years, then lost touch. But if anyone knows her mother's situation, it would be her. Clara took the paper with Sarah's address and phone number. Thank you, Ruth. Clara, Ruth said as she walked her to the door. Be careful. The Garretts don't forgive people who cross them. Whatever happened to Daniel, whatever Marcus did, Thomas has that same kind of power now. Maybe worse, because he's learned to hide it better. I know, Clara said. But I spent 40 years being careful, keeping quiet, not making waves. I'm done with that. Daniel gave up his whole life for love. The least I can do is make sure that love is remembered. Ruth hugged her, something they hadn't done in years. Then I'll help however I can. For Daniel. And for Elizabeth. Clara drove home with Sarah Mitchell's contact information in her pocket and a sense of purpose burning in her chest. She'd found the first thread. Now she just had to keep pulling until the whole truth unraveled. Clara spent the rest of that Saturday in the cabin where Daniel had lived his exile. She'd packed a lunch and her camping gear, telling herself she needed to document everything properly before deciding what to do next. But the truth was simpler. She needed to be close to her brother, to understand the life he'd lived in these hidden woods. The November cold bit at her exposed skin as she searched every corner of the small structure. In the wooden crate beneath the window, she found supplies Daniel had carefully preserved. Candles, matches in waterproof containers, a hand-crank radio that no longer worked. There were books too, their pages yellowed but readable. Poetry mostly, Frost Whitman, a worn copy of sonnets from the Portuguese that made Clara's throat tight when she realized it had probably reminded him of Elizabeth, but it was the small metal box hidden behind a loose floorboard that undid her completely. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a delicate silver locket on a thin chain. Clara opened it with trembling fingers. On one side was a lock of dark hair, still lustrous despite the decades. On the other, engraved in script so tiny she had to squint to read it. Forever, despite everything. Clara held the locket up to the light streaming through the window, watching it spin slowly. This was Elizabeth's, had to be. A token of love she'd given Daniel before their world fell apart. He'd kept it close all these years, this small piece of the woman he could never have. She fastened the chain around her own neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her heart. She would keep it safe until she could return it to its rightful owner, or to Elizabeth's daughter if Elizabeth was no longer alive. Clara spent the afternoon reading more of Daniel's journal, the later entries that she'd skimmed over in her first frantic reading. These were harder to read, sparse, sometimes years apart, the handwriting shakier as Daniel aged. One entry from 1990 stopped her cold. Saw Elizabeth in town today from a distance. She was at the general store with a little girl, maybe 4 or 5. Pretty child with dark curls and her mother's eyes. Elizabeth looked thin, worn down. The girl was chattering about something, pulling at her mother's hand, and Elizabeth smiled at her. It was a ghost of the smile I remember, but it was there. She's a mother now. She's built a life, even if it's not the one she wanted. I'm glad for that, at least. Glad she has something good that came from all this pain. The girl's name is Sarah. I heard Elizabeth call it as they walked to their car. Sarah, it's a good name. Clara closed her eyes, imagining Daniel watching from the shadows as the woman he loved lived her life without him, raising a child with a man she didn't love. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She read on through the years. Daniel wrote about the changing seasons, about animals he observed, about storms that nearly destroyed the cabin and repairs he made alone. He wrote less and less about Elizabeth as time went on, as if even thinking about her had become too painful. I'm 52 today, one entry read, dated 15 years ago. I've now spent more years in exile than I spent in the world. Sometimes I forget what it was like to have conversations, to laugh with people, to be touched by another human being. The forest is my companion now. The silence is my friend. I tell myself I'm at peace with this choice, that protecting Elizabeth was worth it. Most days I even believe it. The last dated entry was 12 years old, the one Clara had read before about winter coming and hoping someone would find the journal. But tucked after those final written words, Clara found pages that weren't written on, just marked with pressed flowers. Wild roses, columbine, Indian paintbrush. Elizabeth's favorites, Daniel had written earlier. He'd collected them even after he'd stopped writing, even after the journal became too painful to fill with words. Clara carefully removed several of the pressed flowers, placed them in a small envelope she found among Daniel's supplies. These too would go to Elizabeth, or to Sarah, physical proof of love that had lasted decades. As afternoon faded into evening, Clara locked up the cabin and hiked back to her homestead. Her mind was full of Daniel, of Elizabeth, of a love story that should have had a different ending. She thought about what Ruth had said, that Elizabeth had mentioned once wanting to run away with someone. Had she held on to that memory all these years? Had she suspected Daniel might still be alive, or had she accepted his death as everyone else had? At home, Clara made herself a simple dinner she barely tasted. Then she sat at her kitchen table with Sarah Mitchell's phone number in front of her. It was 8 o'clock, a reasonable time to call, even on a Saturday evening. She dialed before she could second-guess herself. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, cautious. "Hello? Is this Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes, who's calling?" "My name is Clara Boone. I'm calling from Montana, from Timber Ridge. I believe your mother is Elizabeth Garrett." Silence on the other end, thick and wary. "Then how did you get this number?" "From Ruth Callahan. She taught you years ago when you were young." "She said you and your mother—" Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. "I need to talk to you about something." "About your mother and about my brother Daniel." Another pause, longer this time. "I don't understand. What does your brother have to do with my mother?" "Everything," Clara said quietly. "He has everything to do with your mother. And I have something she needs to see, something I think you need to see too. But it's not a conversation for the phone. Would you be willing to meet?" "You're in Montana?" "Yes, but I can drive to Oregon. I can be there in 2 days. This is about my mother." Sarah's voice had changed, grown softer, tinged with something that might have been hope or fear. "Is she all right?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I haven't seen her. But I have information about her past, about someone she loved before she married your father. I think you deserve to know the truth." Sarah was quiet for so long, Clara thought the connection had dropped. "Then come to Eugene. I'll text you my address." "But Clara Boone, if this is some kind of scheme or trick, it's not. I promise you, this is about love and loss and truth." "That's all?" "All right," Sarah said finally. "I'll see you in 2 days." The call ended and Clara sat staring at her phone. She'd taken the first real step toward fulfilling Daniel's final wish. There was no going back now. She spent Sunday preparing for the trip. She made copies of the most important journal entries, took photographs of the cabin and its contents, secured the original journal in a waterproof case. The locket stayed around her neck, hidden beneath her sweater. She packed a bag with clothes for several days. Withdrew cash from her account at the bank, not much, but enough to cover gas and a motel if needed. On Monday morning before dawn, she loaded her old truck and locked up her house. She told old Sam she'd be gone for a week. Visiting a friend, asked him to check on her property. He'd agreed without prying, though she'd seen the curiosity in his eyes. The drive west was long and gave her too much time to think. She took Highway 200 through the mountains, watching the landscape shift from Montana pine forests to Idaho valleys to Oregon's high desert. She stopped for the night in Baker City, got a room at a modest motel, and lay awake, wondering what she'd say to Sarah Mitchell. How did you tell someone their mother's entire life had been shaped by a forced choice? How did you explain that the man their mother was meant to be with had lived in exile for decades, watching from the shadows, dying alone in the forest? Clara arrived in Eugene on Tuesday afternoon. The city was larger than she'd expected, green and wet from recent rain. Sarah's address led her to a modest craftsman house in an older neighborhood, the kind of place that spoke of careful maintenance and quiet pride. She sat in her truck for 5 minutes, gathering courage. Then she walked to the front door and knocked. The woman who answered was in her early 50s, with dark hair showing threads of grey and eyes that were strikingly familiar. Elizabeth's eyes, Clara realized. She had her mother's eyes, Clara Boone. "Yes, Sarah?" "Come in." Sarah stepped back, her expression guarded but not hostile. The house was warm and inviting, filled with books and plants. Sarah led her to a living room where 2 cups of tea already waited on the coffee table. "I'm not sure why I made tea for you," Sarah said as they sat. "Maybe because this all feels surreal and tea seemed normal." "Thank you," Clara said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Sarah studied her face. Ruth called me yesterday. Said I should hear you out, that what you had to tell me was important. She wouldn't say more than that. Ruth is a good person. She was kind to my mother when no one else was, Sarah said. That's why I stayed in touch with her, at least for a while. So, you said this was about someone my mother loved before my father. I always suspected there was someone. She had this sadness about her, this sense of something lost. But she never talked about her life before the marriage. Clara set down her tea and pulled out the photograph, the one of Daniel and Elizabeth by the river, both of them laughing, young and in love. Sarah took it with shaking hands. Oh my God, that's her. That's my mother, but I've never seen her look like this. So happy. That's my brother Daniel, Clara said. The photograph was taken in July of 1985, a few months before your mother married your father. Sarah looked up sharply. Your brother, Daniel Boone. The man who went missing? He didn't go missing, Clara said gently. He left. He went into hiding to protect your mother and both of their families from your grandfather's threats. For the next hour, Clara told Sarah everything. She showed her excerpts from the journal, explained about the ultimatum Marcus Garrett had given Daniel, described the cabin where Daniel had lived for years. She showed her the pressed flowers, the locket, the evidence of a love that had endured decades of separation. Sarah wept as she read Daniel's words, her hands trembling as she touched the delicate locket. All these years, she whispered. My mother never knew. She thought he was dead or that he'd abandoned her. He never abandoned her, Clara said firmly. He watched over her from a distance. He saw you as a child, wrote about you in his journal. He was glad she had you, glad something good came from her life. She was so sad, Sarah said, wiping her eyes. My whole childhood she was just absent somehow. Present physically, but somewhere else emotionally. My father was cold, controlling, not violent, but there was no warmth in that house, no love. I left the day I turned 18 and barely looked back. I tried to get my mother to come with me, but she wouldn't. She said it was too late for her, that she'd made her choices. They weren't her choices, Clara said. They were choices made for her by powerful men who cared more about pride and money than human happiness. Sarah looked at the photograph again, at her mother's radiant smile. I want her to know. I want her to know he never forgot her, that he sacrificed everything to keep her safe. She deserves to know she was loved like that. That's why I'm here, Clara said. Your mother's last wish, according to Daniel's final journal entry, was to tell her he kept his promise. I need to do that, but I don't know how to reach her without your father finding out. He travels, Sarah said immediately. Twice a month, sometimes more. Goes to Seattle or Portland for business. When he's gone, my mother is alone, except for household staff. She walks the gardens every morning at dawn. She's done that for as long as I can remember. Ruth told you that. She did. Sarah stood and paced to the window, her back to Clara. I haven't been home in over 30 years. I cut all ties with that family, changed my name when I married, built a life as far from them as I could. But this, she turned back, determination in her eyes that reminded Clara of Daniel. This is bigger than my resentment or my fear. My mother deserves the truth. When is he next traveling? I don't know. I can find out, Sarah said. I still have ways of getting information. Give me a few days. Where are you staying? I'll find a motel. Don't be ridiculous. You'll stay here. Sarah's voice was firm. You've driven all this way to honor your brother's memory and give my mother peace. The least I can do is offer you a place to sleep. Clara felt her eyes sting with unexpected tears. Thank you. That evening they sat together going through the journal more carefully. Sarah read her mother's name over and over in Daniel's handwriting, traced the pressed flowers with gentle fingers, held the locket up to the light the same way Clara had. Tell me about him, Sarah said finally. What was he like before all this? So Clara talked about Daniel, about the brother who'd taught her to track deer, who'd helped her with her homework, who'd made their mother laugh with terrible jokes. She talked about his kindness, his love for these mountains, his quiet strength. He sounds like someone worth loving, Sarah said softly. He was. And your mother, from what he wrote, from everything I've learned, she was worth the sacrifice he made. That kind of love doesn't come often. No, Sarah agreed. It doesn't. They spent the next 3 days in a strange kind of limbo. Sarah made calls, reached out to old contacts, tried to find out Thomas Garrett's travel schedule. Clara helped around the house, cooked meals, and told Sarah stories about Montana and the mountains and the life her mother had known before everything changed. On Thursday afternoon, Sarah got the information she needed. "He's leaving Saturday morning for Seattle," she said. "Business meeting that will keep him through Monday. My mother will be alone at the estate except for the staff. If we're going to do this, that's our window." Clara nodded. "Then we do it Saturday." "We," Sarah repeated. "I'm coming with you. I need to see my mother." And her voice cracked slightly. "She needs to know I don't blame her for how I grew up. That I understand now why she was so sad." "Are you sure?" My father doesn't get to control my life anymore," Sarah said firmly. "He took enough from all of us. He doesn't get another moment." Friday was spent preparing. They would drive back to Montana together, arriving late Friday night. Saturday at dawn, they'd go to the Garrett estate, approach Elizabeth during her morning walk, and tell her everything. It was risky. Thomas might have security, might have staff who'd report back to him. But Sarah was determined, and Clara knew that some truths couldn't wait for perfect circumstances. As they loaded Clara's truck Friday morning, Sarah held up the photograph one more time, the one of Daniel and Elizabeth by the river. "Young and laughing and full of hope. They should have had a lifetime," she said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "They should have. But they'll have this, the truth told, the sacrifice acknowledged, the love remembered. That's not nothing." "No," Sarah said, carefully tucking the photograph into her bag along with the journal and pressed flowers. "That's not nothing at all." They drove east through the mountains, toward Montana, and a reckoning 40 years in the making. They arrived in Timber Ridge late Friday night, the town dark and quiet under a sliver of moon. Clara drove past her own homestead and continued to a small motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions and the owner barely looked up from his television when they checked. Sarah was quiet as they settled into the simple room with its 2 double beds and faded floral wallpaper. She stood at the window, looking out at the dark shapes of mountains against the starlit sky. "I never thought I'd come back here," she said softly. "I swore I wouldn't, that there was nothing in this place worth returning for." Clara sat on one of the beds, her joints aching from the long drive. "What changed your mind?" "My mother deserves to know the truth. And maybe," Sarah turned from the window, her face shadowed in the dim light, "maybe I deserve to understand her better. All those years I resented her silence, her sadness, the way she seemed to just accept everything my father decided. I thought she was weak, but she wasn't weak. She was trapped." "She was both," Clara said gently. "Trapped, yes, but it takes strength to survive that kind of cage for decades." "Your mother endured." Sarah nodded slowly. "Will you tell me more about the cabin? About where Daniel lived?" So Clara described it, the careful construction, the hidden location, the evidence of a life lived in solitude but with purpose. She talked about finding the journal, about the bleeding horse that had led her. "Ruth, something that changes everything I thought I knew about the day he disappeared. What did you find?" Clara hesitated, then decided Ruth deserved to know at least part of the truth. Evidence that he didn't just disappear, that he left to protect people he loved. And one of those people was Elizabeth Garrett. Ruth stared at her. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying my brother and Elizabeth were in love. And Marcus Garrett made sure they could never be together. He threatened Daniel, threatened our family, threatened hers. Daniel chose exile to keep everyone safe." "Oh, Clara." Ruth's hand covered her mouth. All these years he was alive, living in the forest, watching over her from a distance, and she never knew. She thought he'd abandoned her, or died, or just disappeared. But he kept his promise. He stayed away to protect her." Tears rolled down Ruth's cheeks. "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." "It is," Clara agreed. "But now I need to tell her the truth. She deserves to know that Daniel loved her, that he sacrificed everything for her. Can you help me reach her?" Ruth wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Thomas goes to the city for business regularly. Twice a month, usually gone for 2 or 3 days. Elizabeth walks the estate gardens every morning at dawn. She's done that for as long as I've known of her. If you wanted to approach her, that would be the time. When Thomas is gone and she's alone, when is he next traveling? I don't know his schedule anymore, Clara, but Ruth stood and went to a drawer, pulled out an old address book. She flipped through it and wrote something on a piece of paper. This is someone who might know. Sarah Mitchell. She used to be Sarah Garrett, Thomas and Elizabeth's daughter. She left home as soon as she turned 18, moved to Oregon. We corresponded for a few years, then lost touch. But if anyone knows her mother's situation, it would be her. Clara took the paper with Sarah's address and phone number. Thank you, Ruth. Clara, Ruth said as she walked her to the door. Be careful. The Garretts don't forgive people who cross them. Whatever happened to Daniel, whatever Marcus did, Thomas has that same kind of power now. Maybe worse, because he's learned to hide it better. I know, Clara said. But I spent 40 years being careful, keeping quiet, not making waves. I'm done with that. Daniel gave up his whole life for love. The least I can do is make sure that love is remembered. Ruth hugged her, something they hadn't done in years. Then I'll help however I can. For Daniel. And for Elizabeth. Clara drove home with Sarah Mitchell's contact information in her pocket and a sense of purpose burning in her chest. She'd found the first thread. Now she just had to keep pulling until the whole truth unraveled. Clara spent the rest of that Saturday in the cabin where Daniel had lived his exile. She'd packed a lunch and her camping gear, telling herself she needed to document everything properly before deciding what to do next. But the truth was simpler. She needed to be close to her brother, to understand the life he'd lived in these hidden woods. The November cold bit at her exposed skin as she searched every corner of the small structure. In the wooden crate beneath the window, she found supplies Daniel had carefully preserved. Candles, matches in waterproof containers, a hand-crank radio that no longer worked. There were books too, their pages yellowed but readable. Poetry mostly, Frost Whitman, a worn copy of sonnets from the Portuguese that made Clara's throat tight when she realized it had probably reminded him of Elizabeth, but it was the small metal box hidden behind a loose floorboard that undid her completely. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a delicate silver locket on a thin chain. Clara opened it with trembling fingers. On one side was a lock of dark hair, still lustrous despite the decades. On the other, engraved in script so tiny she had to squint to read it. Forever, despite everything. Clara held the locket up to the light streaming through the window, watching it spin slowly. This was Elizabeth's, had to be. A token of love she'd given Daniel before their world fell apart. He'd kept it close all these years, this small piece of the woman he could never have. She fastened the chain around her own neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her heart. She would keep it safe until she could return it to its rightful owner, or to Elizabeth's daughter if Elizabeth was no longer alive. Clara spent the afternoon reading more of Daniel's journal, the later entries that she'd skimmed over in her first frantic reading. These were harder to read, sparse, sometimes years apart, the handwriting shakier as Daniel aged. One entry from 1990 stopped her cold. Saw Elizabeth in town today from a distance. She was at the general store with a little girl, maybe 4 or 5. Pretty child with dark curls and her mother's eyes. Elizabeth looked thin, worn down. The girl was chattering about something, pulling at her mother's hand, and Elizabeth smiled at her. It was a ghost of the smile I remember, but it was there. She's a mother now. She's built a life, even if it's not the one she wanted. I'm glad for that, at least. Glad she has something good that came from all this pain. The girl's name is Sarah. I heard Elizabeth call it as they walked to their car. Sarah, it's a good name. Clara closed her eyes, imagining Daniel watching from the shadows as the woman he loved lived her life without him, raising a child with a man she didn't love. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She read on through the years. Daniel wrote about the changing seasons, about animals he observed, about storms that nearly destroyed the cabin and repairs he made alone. He wrote less and less about Elizabeth as time went on, as if even thinking about her had become too painful. I'm 52 today, one entry read, dated 15 years ago. I've now spent more years in exile than I spent in the world. Sometimes I forget what it was like to have conversations, to laugh with people, to be touched by another human being. The forest is my companion now. The silence is my friend. I tell myself I'm at peace with this choice, that protecting Elizabeth was worth it. Most days I even believe it. The last dated entry was 12 years old, the one Clara had read before about winter coming and hoping someone would find the journal. But tucked after those final written words, Clara found pages that weren't written on, just marked with pressed flowers. Wild roses, columbine, Indian paintbrush. Elizabeth's favorites, Daniel had written earlier. He'd collected them even after he'd stopped writing. Even after the journal became too painful to fill with words. Clara carefully removed several of the pressed flowers, placed them in a small envelope she found among Daniel's supplies. These too would go to Elizabeth, or to Sarah, physical proof of love that had lasted decades. As afternoon faded into evening, Clara locked up the cabin and hiked back to her homestead. Her mind was full of Daniel, of Elizabeth, of a love story that should have had a different ending. She thought about what Ruth had said, that Elizabeth had mentioned once wanting to run away with someone. Had she held on to that memory all these years? Had she suspected Daniel might still be alive, or had she accepted his death as everyone else had? At home, Clara made herself a simple dinner she barely tasted. Then she sat at her kitchen table with Sarah Mitchell's phone number in front of her. It was 8 o'clock, a reasonable time to call, even on a Saturday evening. She dialed before she could second-guess herself. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, cautious. "Hello? Is this Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes. Who's calling?" "My name is Clara Boone. I'm calling from Montana, from Timber Ridge. I believe your mother is Elizabeth Garrett." Silence on the other end, thick and wary. "Then how did you get this number?" "From Ruth Callahan. She taught you years ago when you were young." "She said you and your mother—" Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. "I need to talk to you about something. About your mother and about my brother Daniel." Another pause, longer this time. "I don't understand. What does your brother have to do with my mother?" "Everything," Clara said quietly. "He has everything to do with your mother. And I have something she needs to see, something I think you need to see too. But it's not a conversation for the phone. Would you be willing to meet?" "You're in Montana?" "Yes, but I can drive to Oregon. I can be there in 2 days. This is about my mother." Sarah's voice had changed, grown softer, tinged with something that might have been hope or fear. "Is she all right?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I haven't seen her. But I have information about her past, about someone she loved before she married your father. I think you deserve to know the truth." Sarah was quiet for so long, Clara thought the connection had dropped. "Then come to Eugene. I'll text you my address." "But Clara Boone, if this is some kind of scheme or trick, it's not. I promise you, this is about love and loss and truth." "That's all?" "All right," Sarah said finally. "I'll see you in 2 days." The call ended and Clara sat staring at her phone. She'd taken the first real step toward fulfilling Daniel's final wish. There was no going back now. She spent Sunday preparing for the trip. She made copies of the most important journal entries, took photographs of the cabin and its contents, secured the original journal in a waterproof case. The locket stayed around her neck, hidden beneath her sweater. She packed a bag with clothes for several days. Withdrew cash from her account at the bank, not much, but enough to cover gas and a motel if needed. On Monday morning before dawn, she loaded her old truck and locked up her house. She told old Sam she'd be gone for a week. "Thomas Garrett. Not you, not Daniel. You were both victims of their cruelty." She took her mother's hands. "But it's not too late, Mother. We can't change the past, but we can honor Daniel's memory. We can make sure people know what happened, what he sacrificed." Elizabeth's face hardened suddenly, a flash of something fierce showing through the grief. "Thomas, does Thomas know you're here?" "He's in Seattle," Sarah said. "We waited until he was gone." "He knew," Elizabeth said quietly. "All these years, he knew Daniel was alive, or at least that he'd been forced into exile. He knew what his father did, and he never told me. He let me mourn. He let me spend 40 years thinking—" She stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists. "He has to answer for this. They both— Marcus is dead, but Thomas— Mother, Sarah said carefully. "What are you thinking?" Elizabeth looked between Clara and her daughter, and for the first time since they'd arrived, Clara saw something other than sadness in her eyes. She saw anger, determination, a spark of the young woman who'd been willing to run away with the man she loved. "I'm thinking," Elizabeth said slowly, "that I'm tired of being silent. I'm tired of accepting what powerful men decide for me. Daniel gave up everything for love. The least I can do is make sure his sacrifice means something, that people know the truth." Clara felt something shift in the air between them, a shared understanding, a common purpose. "I found something else," Clara said. A map Daniel drew, showing hidden paths through the forest. Vantage points where he could watch the valley, She paused. "Watch this estate," Elizabeth's breath caught. "Show me, please. I want to see where he was. I want to walk where he walked." "We can take you there," Clara said. "To the cabin." "Today, if you want." "Yes," Elizabeth said immediately. Then she looked down at herself, the expensive coat, the delicate shoes. "But not like this. And not without preparation. Thomas will be gone through Monday. That gives us time." She turned to Sarah. "Will you stay? Both of you? There's so much I want to know, so much I need to understand. And Sarah," her voice softened, "so much I want to say to you that I should have said years ago." "I'll stay," Sarah said. "Then come to the house," Elizabeth said. "The staff won't question it. I'll tell them your old friend's visiting while Thomas is away. We'll talk properly. We'll plan." She clutched Daniel's journal to her chest. "And tomorrow you'll take me to Daniel's cabin. I need to see it. I need to stand where he stood and understand how he lived." They walked back to the main house together as the sun climbed higher. Three women, united by love and loss, and the beginning of something that felt like justice. The Garrett mansion was even more imposing from the inside. High ceilings with exposed timber beams, stone fireplaces large enough to stand in, furniture that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth. But what struck Clara most was how empty it felt, like a museum rather than a home. Beautiful, but lifeless. Elizabeth led them to a sitting room on the east side of the house, a smaller space with large windows overlooking the gardens. She dismissed the housekeeper who appeared with offers of breakfast, saying only that she had guests and wished for privacy. When they were alone, Elizabeth sank into a chair and looked at her daughter with eyes full of decades of unsaid things. "I don't know where to start." "Start anywhere," Sarah said, sitting across from her. "We have time now," so Elizabeth talked. She told them about growing up as the youngest daughter of a merchant family that had fallen on hard times. Her father had borrowed heavily from Marcus Garrett to keep his business afloat, but the debts had piled up faster than the profits. When Thomas Garrett had shown interest in her at a town dance, her parents had been thrilled. It was the answer to all their problems. Their debt would be forgiven, their business saved, and their daughter would marry into one of the wealthiest families in Montana. "I tried to tell them I didn't love him," Elizabeth said quietly. "But they said love would come in time, that security and stability mattered more than romance. They meant well. They truly believed they were giving me a good life." Then she'd met Daniel at a harvest festival. He'd been different from every other man she'd known. Quiet but confident, comfortable in his own skin, with a way of seeing the world that matched her own. They'd started meeting in secret, knowing her parents would never approve of a match with someone who had nothing but a small family homestead and a love for the mountains. "We were going to leave," Elizabeth said, her fingers tracing the edge of Daniel's journal. "We had it all planned. October 20th, before my wedding date. We were going to drive to Oregon, get married there, start over. Daniel had a friend who could get him work on a ranch. I was going to study botany like I'd always dreamed. We were going to have a simple life, but it would be ours." Her voice broke, and Clara reached over to squeeze her hand. "Then Marcus found out," Elizabeth continued. "I don't know how. Maybe someone saw us together. Maybe he had people watching Thomas's fiancée. But he found out, and she closed her eyes. "He came to see me. Told me if I didn't marry Thomas, my father would lose everything. The business, our home, everything. And he said if Daniel tried to interfere, he'd make sure Daniel's family suffered the same fate." He was very calm when he said it, very matter of fact, as if destroying lives was just business to him. "What did you do?" Sarah asked softly. "I went to Daniel. I told him we had to leave immediately that night. But Marcus had gotten to him first. Daniel," her voice caught on his name, "Daniel told me he couldn't let me sacrifice my family, that he wouldn't let his parents lose everything because of him. We argued, I begged him. I said we could run far enough away that Marcus couldn't touch us. But Daniel knew better. He knew men like Marcus Garrett had reached that extended beyond county lines, beyond state lines even." She opened the journal again, running her fingers over Daniel's handwriting. "The last time I saw him, he held me and told me he loved me, that he would always love me. Then he kissed my forehead and walked away. 3 days later, the news came that he'd gone missing in the mountains. Search parties went out. I wanted to join them, but Marcus wouldn't allow it. Said it wouldn't be appropriate for Thomas's fiancée to show such interest in another man's disappearance." "But Marcus told you Daniel had died," Clara said. "Yes, about 2 weeks into the search. He came to me privately, said they'd found evidence Daniel had fallen into a ravine, that his body had been recovered but was too damaged for viewing. He said it was a mercy that Daniel had died quickly, that at least I could have closure and move forward with my marriage. I believed him. I had no reason not to. He showed me official papers, a death certificate signed by the county coroner." Clara felt her anger surge. "It was all lies. Forged documents to make sure you'd go through with the wedding." "Yes," Elizabeth whispered. "All lies. I married Thomas 2 weeks later. I was in shock, I think. I don't remember much about the ceremony. I know I wore the dress my mother had chosen, spoke the vows I was supposed to speak, smiled for the photographs. But inside I was dead. I'd lost the only person I'd ever loved, and I was marrying a man I didn't even know for the sake of family duty." Sarah's face was wet with tears. "What was he like?" "Father, I mean." "In the beginning," Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "He wasn't cruel. Not in obvious ways. He was distant, controlled, more interested in business and the family legacy than in me. I think he knew I didn't love him. Maybe he even knew why. But he never spoke of it, never acknowledged it. We had separate bedrooms from the start. Our marriage was a transaction, not a partnership. But you had me," Sarah said. "Yes." Elizabeth's face softened slightly. You are the only good thing that came from those years. Thomas wanted an heir, wanted children to carry on the Garrett name. I wanted someone to love, someone who was mine. When you were born, Sarah, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever, joy, purpose. You gave me a reason to keep going, but I also reminded you of what you'd lost," Sarah said quietly. "Didn't I? Every day you looked at me, you thought about the children you might have had with Daniel." Elizabeth looked stricken. "Oh, Sarah, no. You were never a reminder of loss. You were—" She reached for her daughter's hand. "You were hope. You were proof that love could still exist in my life, even if it was different from what I'd imagined. I'm sorry I wasn't a better mother. I'm sorry my sadness cast a shadow over your childhood. But I never, not for one moment, wished you were anyone other than who you are." They sat in silence for a moment, mother and daughter reconnecting across decades of distance. Then Elizabeth turned to Clara. "Tell me about Daniel's last years. What do you know?" Clara pulled out more sections of the journal, the later entries she'd read in the cabin. "He lived simply, survived on what the forest provided, supplemented by supplies he must have gotten from somewhere, maybe a town far enough away that no one would recognize him. He watched you from a distance, saw you with Sarah when she was young. He was glad you had her, glad you had something good in your life." She showed Elizabeth the pressed flowers, explaining that Daniel had continued collecting them even after he'd stopped writing regularly in the journal. "These were from the last pages." "Oh," Clara said, handing over several delicate blooms preserved between sheets of paper. "Wild roses, your favorites." Elizabeth held them as if they were made of glass. He remembered. After everything, after all those years alone, he remembered a conversation we had about wildflowers. She looked up at Clara, her eyes red but clear. "How did he die? Do you know?" "I don't," Clara admitted. "His last entry was 12 years ago. He wrote about winter coming, about getting older, about hoping someone would find the journal someday. Then nothing. I don't know if he died in the cabin or somewhere else in the forest. I don't know if it was illness or age or... She paused. I like to think it was peaceful, that he went to sleep one night and just didn't wake up. Alone, Elizabeth said, her voice breaking. He died alone because of me, not because of you, Clara said firmly. Because of Marcus Garrett. Because of a system that let men like him wield power without accountability. Daniel made his choice knowing what it meant. He chose to protect you, to keep you safe. That was love, Elizabeth. That was the deepest kind of love there is. Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where she'd spent so many mornings walking alone. I used to feel like someone was watching me, she said quietly. Sometimes when I walked out there, I'd get this feeling, like I wasn't alone. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief had made me paranoid. But it was him, wasn't it? He was out there watching over me. Yes, Clara said. He wrote about it. About standing in the trees where you couldn't see him, watching you walk. He said you moved like you were carrying the weight of the world, and it broke his heart. I was carrying the weight of the world, Elizabeth said. The weight of a love I couldn't have, a life I didn't choose, a lie I'd been told about the man I loved. And all the while he was right there. She turned back to them, her face set with determination. I want to see the cabin. I want to go there today. I need to stand where he stood, see what he saw, understand how he lived. It's a difficult hike, Clara warned. Several hours through rough terrain. I don't care. I've been trapped in this house for 40 years. I think I can handle a walk through the forest. Sarah stood. Then let's go. Let's do what we came here to do. Honor Daniel's memory and give my mother the closure she deserves. They made preparations quickly. Elizabeth changed into practical clothes, jeans and a warm sweater that Clara suspected she hadn't worn in years. She looked different in casual clothing, younger somehow, more like the woman in Daniel's photographs. They took Clara's truck, driving in silence through the morning toward the forest where Daniel had made his exile. Elizabeth sat in the front passenger seat, clutching the journal and the bundle of pressed flowers, her eyes fixed on the mountains ahead. The hike was exactly as difficult as Clara had warned. The terrain was steep and unforgiving, the paths barely visible even to someone who knew they were there. But Elizabeth pushed forward with a determination that surprised Clara. She didn't complain about the cold or the difficulty. She just kept walking, following Clara's lead deeper into the wilderness. They reached the cabin just past noon. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the small clearing, staring at the structure that had been her beloved's home for so many years. Her face was pale but composed. This is where he lived, she said. Not a question but a statement of fact. Yes, Clara confirmed. He built it himself. You can see his father's influence in the construction, the way the logs are joined, the pitch of the roof. Elizabeth walked slowly to the cabin door, which Clara had secured but not locked after her first visit. She pushed it open and stepped inside, Sarah and Clara following behind her. The interior was exactly as Clara had left it, the narrow cot, the wood stove, the shelves with their long-expired supplies. Elizabeth moved through the space as if in a trance, touching everything gently. The blanket on the cot, the cup on the shelf, the books stacked near the window. She found the sonnets from the Portuguese and opened it carefully. Inside, on the title page, was an inscription in Daniel's hand. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. Though years and distance separate us, my answer remains the same. All of them, forever. Elizabeth's knees gave out and she sank to the floor, the book pressed to her chest, sobbing in great heaving gasps that shook her entire body. Sarah dropped down beside her, holding her mother as years of suppressed grief finally broke free. Clara stood by the window, giving them space, her own tears falling silently. This cabin had been Daniel's prison and his sanctuary, the place where he'd chosen to live out his days, rather than bring harm to those he loved. Now it was witnessing the reunion it had always deserved, Elizabeth finally understanding the depth of Daniel's sacrifice, finally knowing that his love had never wavered. When Elizabeth's sobs finally subsided, she looked up at Clara. "Show me where he could see the estate from. Please, I need to understand." They helped her up, and Clara led them outside. Following the map Daniel had drawn to one of his vantage points. It was a rocky outcropping, about 15 minutes from the cabin, hidden by trees but offering a clear view of the valley below. From there, they could see the Garrett estate, the main house, the gardens, the paths Elizabeth walked every morning. It was far enough away that details were impossible to make out, but close enough to see movement, to recognize the layout. "He stood here," Clara said quietly, "probably hundreds of times over the years, watching you walk, watching the house, staying close, even though he could never approach." Elizabeth stood at the exact spot Daniel must have occupied, looking down at the life she'd lived while he watched from the shadows. "I felt him," she whispered. "I knew I wasn't alone. Some part of me always knew." She turned to face the forest, the vast wilderness that had been Daniel's world. "He lived here for me. He gave up his family, his future, his very identity. He became a ghost so I could be safe." Her voice cracked. "That's the most profound act of love I can imagine. And I never got to thank him. I never got to tell him it mattered, that I never forgot him, that I loved him every single day, even when I thought he was dead." "He knew," Clara said. "I think somehow he knew. Love like that, it doesn't need words. It exists beyond language, beyond presence. He knew you loved him because you both made the same choice, to endure an impossible life rather than let the other suffer." They stood together in silence. 3 women united by a love story that had no happy ending, but demanded to be remembered anyway. The November wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of snow that would soon blanket these mountains. Finally, Sarah spoke. "What do we do now? We have the truth, we have the evidence. But what do we do with it?" Elizabeth's face hardened with that same determination Clara had seen earlier. "We make sure people know. We make sure Daniel's sacrifice isn't forgotten, buried by the same family that caused it. We tell his story. Thomas won't let that happen without a fight," Sarah warned. "Then let him fight," Elizabeth said coldly. "I've been silent for 40 years. I'm done protecting the Garrett name, done pretending the past doesn't matter. Daniel deserves justice, even if it's 40 years too late." Clara felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of purpose fulfilled. "Then we tell the story. We tell it to everyone who will listen. And we start with Thomas Garrett himself. He needs to face what his father did, what he allowed to continue by keeping silent." They made their way back down the mountain as afternoon light slanted through the trees. They were tired, emotionally drained, but united in purpose. Daniel's story would be told. His love for Elizabeth would be remembered, and the Garrett family would finally face the consequences of their cruelty, even if those consequences came decades too late. That evening, back at the Garrett mansion, Elizabeth made phone calls. To the local newspaper editor she'd known for years, to a lawyer she trusted who owed her no loyalty to Thomas, to the historical society that documented the region's stories. She told them all the same thing. She had a story to tell, a truth that had been buried for too long, and she was ready to speak. Thomas Garrett would be home in 2 days. By then, the world would know what his father had done. By then, the comfortable lie the family had lived with for 4 decades would be shattered. Justice, Clara thought as she watched Elizabeth make call after call with quiet determination, sometimes comes late, but it still comes. Sunday morning brought unexpected visitors to the Garrett estate. Clara woke in one of the guest rooms, a space more luxurious than anywhere she'd ever slept, to the sound of voices downstairs. Raised voices, one of them unmistakably angry. She dressed quickly and found Sarah already in the hallway, her face tense. "That's my father," Sarah whispered. "He's home early." They descended the stairs together to find Thomas Garrett standing in the entrance hall, his face flushed with anger, while Elizabeth faced him with a calmness that seemed to infuriate him further. "What is the meaning of this?" Thomas demanded. He was a tall man in his early 70s, still imposing despite his age, with grey hair and the kind of bearing that spoke of a lifetime of getting his way. I received calls, Elizabeth, from the newspaper, from the Historical Society, people asking me to comment on some story about my father. What have you done? I've told the truth, Elizabeth said quietly. Finally, after 40 years of silence, I've told the truth about what your father did to Daniel Boone and to me. Thomas's eyes swept the hallway and landed on Sarah. His expression shifted from anger to shock. Sarah, what are you doing here? I came to see my mother, Sarah said, moving to stand beside Elizabeth. To help her do what she should have done decades ago, expose your family's crimes. Crimes. Thomas's voice rose. What are you talking about? My father built this family, provided for this community. Your father destroyed lives to maintain power, Clara said, stepping forward. I'm Clara Boone. Daniel was my brother. And I have evidence of everything Marcus Garrett did to force Daniel into exile. Thomas's face went pale. For a moment he seemed to struggle for words. Then he rallied. You have no idea what you're talking about. Daniel Boone went missing 40 years ago. He died in these mountains. That's a tragedy, but it's not. He didn't die, Elizabeth interrupted. Not then. He lived, Thomas. He lived for years in a cabin in the forest because your father threatened to destroy both our families if we tried to be together. And you knew. You've always known. I don't know what lies you've been told, Thomas started, but Elizabeth cut him off. Don't lie to me anymore. I'm done with lies. She held up Daniel's journal. I have his words, his account of everything that happened. Your father gave him an ultimatum. Disappear forever or watch both families be ruined. Daniel chose exile to protect me, to protect everyone he loved. And you married me knowing I loved someone else, knowing your father had destroyed my chance at happiness. Thomas's jaw worked, but no sound came out. His eyes were fixed on the journal, and Clara saw something flicker across his face, not quite guilt, but something close to it. Recognition, perhaps, acknowledgement. My father did what he thought was necessary, Thomas said finally, his voice tight. To protect the family, to maintain our position, to control people like they were possessions, Sarah said sharply. To play God with other people's lives because he had money and power and thought that made him superior. Thomas turned on his daughter. You have no right to judge. You ran away from this family, from your responsibilities. I escaped, Sarah corrected. From a cold house and a father who cared more about the family name than his own child. I escaped, and I built a real life, one not based on manipulation and control. The color in Thomas's face deepened. Get out! Both of you, he gestured at Clara and Sarah. This is my house. You're trespassing. Actually, Elizabeth said, her voice still calm but carrying a steel Clara hadn't heard before. This is my house too. I've lived here for 40 years. I've endured your distance, your coldness, your complete disinterest in anything beyond business and legacy. I played the role of the perfect Garrett wife. But I'm done, and these women are my guests. Thomas stared at his wife, as if seeing her for the first time. Elizabeth, be reasonable. Whatever you think happened 40 years ago, I don't think, Thomas. I know, and tomorrow the newspaper will publish the story. The Historical Society will archive Daniel's journal. People will know what your father did, what you allowed to continue by staying silent. Elizabeth stepped closer to her husband. Did you know? When you married me, did you know Daniel was alive? The silence that followed was answer enough. Thomas's shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time he looked less like an imposing patriarch and more like an old man caught in a lie. I suspected, he said finally. My father told me Daniel Boone had been taken care of, that he wouldn't be a problem. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. You suspected your father had done something terrible, and you married me anyway, Elizabeth said. You let me grieve someone you knew might still be alive. You let me spend 40 years in pain while you reaped the benefits of your father's cruelty. What was I supposed to do? Thomas's voice rose again, defensive now. Go against my father? Destroy everything he'd built? I was 24 years old, Elizabeth. He controlled everything, the business, the money, my future. I didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Clara said quietly. Daniel had a choice, and he chose love over comfort. He chose to protect others over protecting himself. You chose the opposite. You chose comfort and power, and pretending not to know what evil had been done on your behalf. Thomas looked at her, and for a moment Clara saw something in his eyes. Shame, perhaps, or regret. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cool mask of control he'd worn his whole life. This will destroy the Garrett name, he said. Everything my father built, everything I've maintained. Yes, Elizabeth said simply. It will, and maybe it should. Maybe a name built on destroyed lives and forced silences doesn't deserve to continue. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a drink with shaking hands, and downed it in one swallow. When he turned back, his expression had changed again, calculating now, the businessman finding his footing. There must be some way to resolve this quietly, he said. Some compensation we could offer. You can't buy this away, Sarah said with disgust. This isn't a business problem you can solve with money. Everything can be solved with money, Thomas said automatically, then seemed to realize how that sounded. I only meant there must be some way to acknowledge past mistakes without destroying everything. He was interrupted by the doorbell. The housekeeper appeared, looking uncomfortable. Sir, there are people here. They say they're from the newspaper and they'd like to speak with Mrs. Garrett. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. Show them in. Elizabeth, wait. Thomas started, but she was already moving toward the door. This is happening, Thomas. You can participate or you can stand aside, but you can't stop it. The truth is coming out. Two people entered, a woman in her 50s with a notepad and a younger man with a camera. The woman extended her hand to Elizabeth. Mrs. Garrett? I'm Jennifer Morrison from the Timber Ridge Gazette. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. Thank you for coming, Elizabeth said. I have a story to tell, one that's been buried for too long. They settled in the sitting room, Elizabeth, Clara, Sarah, and the reporters. Thomas stood in the doorway, not quite joining them, but unable to leave. His face was ashen as Elizabeth began to speak, laying out the whole story with a clarity that came from decades of suppressed truth, finally finding voice. She showed them Daniel's journal, reading passages aloud. She showed them the photographs, the pressed flowers, the locket. She described Marcus Garrett's ultimatum, Daniel's forced exile, the lie she'd been told about his death. Jennifer Morrison wrote furiously, her expression shifting from professional interest to genuine emotion as the story unfolded. The photographer took pictures of the journal, the artifacts, Elizabeth's face as she spoke about lost love and wasted years. This is remarkable, Jennifer said when Elizabeth finished. And you're certain you want this published? The Garrett family, no offense, Mr. Garrett, she glanced at Thomas, has considerable influence in this region. There may be pushback. Let there be pushback, Elizabeth said firmly. The truth matters more than comfort. Daniel Boone deserves to have his story told. He deserves to be remembered for the sacrifice he made. Mrs. Garrett, the photographer said hesitantly, would you be willing to visit the cabin? To be photographed there, where Daniel lived? It would make the story more powerful. Elizabeth looked at Clara, who nodded. Yes, Elizabeth said. I'll take you there. Tomorrow, if the weather holds. After the reporters left, promising to handle the story with the sensitivity it deserved, Thomas finally moved into the room. He sank into a chair, looking older than his years. This will be everywhere, he said quietly, not just local news. A story like this, love, sacrifice, a powerful family's dark secret, it will spread. National papers, maybe television. The Garrett name will be exposed, Sarah finished. Associated with cruelty and lies. Yes, that's what happens when you build a legacy on other people's suffering. Thomas looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in decades. I was young. I was trying to please my father. I didn't understand. You understood enough, Sarah said. You just didn't care enough to do anything about it. He turned to Elizabeth. Did you ever love me? Even a little? The question hung in the air, vulnerable in a way Thomas Garrett had never been vulnerable before. Elizabeth considered it carefully before answering. I tried, she said finally. I tried to build something from the wreckage of what I'd lost. But how could I love you when you represented everything that had been taken from me? When looking at you reminded me every day that I'd been forced to give up the person who actually loved me." She paused. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm sorry you were caught in your father's web too. But my sorrow doesn't change what happened. It doesn't make it right." Thomas nodded slowly, defeat evident in every line of his body. "What happens now? Now?" Elizabeth stood, and Clara saw the transformation that had been building since yesterday. This was not the sad, trapped woman who'd walked the gardens alone for 40 years. This was someone who had finally found her voice, her strength. "Now I live the rest of my life telling the truth. Now I make sure Daniel's sacrifice meant something. And now I rebuild my relationship with my daughter, who I should never have let go." She turned to Sarah and Clara. "I want to establish something. A memorial, perhaps, or a foundation. Something in Daniel's name that helps people trapped in situations where power imbalances destroy lives. I have resources," she glanced at Thomas, "whether my husband likes it or not. I want to use them for something good." "That's a beautiful idea," Clara said, feeling tears prick her eyes. "Daniel would have loved that." Thomas stood abruptly. I need some air." He walked toward the door, then paused. Without turning around, he said, "My father was wrong. What he did was wrong. I should have said that 40 years ago. I should have stopped the wedding, should have told you the truth, should have—" His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to be better than him." He left before anyone could respond. Sarah looked at her mother. "Do you think he meant that?" "I think he wants to believe he means it," Elizabeth said. "Whether that's enough, I don't know. But it's not my job to absolve him anymore. That's between him and his own conscience." That evening, Clara sat in the guest room composing a letter. It was addressed to no one, meant for everyone, and it told Daniel's story in her own words, not as his sister seeking justice, but as someone who understood that love sometimes demanded impossible sacrifices. She wrote about growing up with Daniel, about his kindness and his strength. She wrote about the 40 years she'd spent walking alone, carrying grief that she now understood had been unnecessary. He'd been alive, so close, and she'd never known. She wrote about finding the cabin and the journal, about connecting with Elizabeth and Sarah, about discovering a love story that deserved to be remembered. When she finished, she read it aloud to Sarah and Elizabeth. They sat together in the sitting room, a fire crackling in the hearth, 3 women bound by a story that had reshaped all their lives. "It's perfect," Elizabeth said softly. "It honors him. It honors what he did." "Tomorrow we go back to the cabin," Clara said. "For the photographs, to show the world where Daniel lived out his exile." "Tomorrow," Elizabeth agreed. She reached over and took Clara's hand, then Sarah's. "Thank you both. Thank you for bringing him back to me, even if only in memory. Thank you for refusing to let his story die in silence." They sat together as darkness fell outside, as the first snow of the season began to fall over the Montana mountains. Somewhere in those mountains, Daniel had lived and died. But his love, that would live forever now. His sacrifice would be remembered. His story would be told. And the Garrett family's comfortable lies would finally be exposed to the light. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and cold air that turned breath to mist. Clara woke early, as was her habit, and found Elizabeth already dressed in the practical hiking clothes they'd selected the day before. The older woman stood at the window looking out at the mountains, Daniel's journal held close to her chest. "Couldn't sleep?" Clara asked softly. Elizabeth turned, and Clara saw the evidence of a sleepless night in the shadows under her eyes. But there was also something else, a clarity, a sense of purpose that made her look more alive than she probably had in decades. "I kept thinking about him out there," Elizabeth said. "All those years so close but unreachable. I kept wondering if he ever stood here in the dark, looking at this house, wishing things were different." "I'm certain he did," Clara said gently. "His journal makes it clear he never stopped thinking about you, never stopped loving you, and I never stopped loving him." Elizabeth's voice was firm. "Even when I thought he was dead, Even when I tried to make peace with the life I had, I never stopped. Does that make me a terrible person? A terrible wife? It makes you human, Clara said. Love doesn't die just because we will it to. You did the best you could with an impossible situation. Sarah appeared in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She offered one to her mother. The reporters will be here in an hour. The photographer wants to shoot while the morning light is still good. Elizabeth accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. I'm ready. I want the world to see where Daniel lived. I want them to understand what sacrifice looks like. They gathered in the kitchen for a quick breakfast none of them really wanted. Thomas appeared briefly, looking haggard and drawn. He poured himself coffee in silence, avoiding everyone's eyes. I won't be joining you today, he said finally. I need to speak with the family lawyers. There will be legal implications from all this. Let there be implications, Elizabeth said. Your father's crimes shouldn't be protected by time or money. Thomas flinched at the word crimes, but didn't argue. He left without another word, and Clara heard his car pulling away minutes later. He's running, Sarah observed, like he's always run from anything uncomfortable. Let him run, Elizabeth said. We have more important things to do. Jennifer Morrison arrived precisely on time, accompanied by the photographer, whose name was Marcus, which caused a moment of bitter irony that no one commented on, and a third person, an older man Elizabeth recognized. Pastor Henley, Elizabeth said in surprise. I didn't expect to see you here, the pastor smiled kindly. Jennifer called me yesterday, asked if I'd be willing to say a few words about Daniel Boone for the story. I knew him as a young man. He was kind, thoughtful, devoted to his family. When I heard what really happened to him, what he sacrificed, the pastor's voice grew thick with emotion. I wanted to be part of telling his story properly, to honor him as he deserved to be honored. Clara felt her throat tighten. She stepped forward and shook the pastor's hand. Thank you. Daniel would have appreciated that. They loaded into 2 vehicles, Clara's truck and Jennifer's SUV, and made the drive to the forest access point. The journalist asked questions during the drive, taking notes about the geography, the isolation, the difficulty of the terrain. How did he survive out here for so many years? Jennifer asked. The winters in Montana are brutal. He was resourceful, Clara answered. He'd grown up in these mountains, knew how to hunt, how to find water, how to build shelter. And he had, she paused, choosing her words carefully, a powerful reason to survive. Love is a remarkable motivator. The hike took nearly 3 hours. The trail was steep and treacherous in places, made more difficult by patches of snow from the previous night's dusting. Elizabeth never complained, though Clara could see the physical effort it cost her. She pushed forward with a determination that spoke of 40 years of pent-up need to understand, to see, to finally be close to Daniel in some way. Pastor Henley struggled with the climb, being in his 80s now, but he refused offers to turn back. Daniel made this walk countless times, he said, breathing hard. I can manage it once to honor his memory. When they finally reached the clearing and the cabin came into view, Elizabeth stopped dead. Her hand flew to her mouth and tears spilled down her cheeks immediately. He built this, she whispered. He made a life here alone because he loved me. The photographer began taking pictures of the cabin from various angles, of the clearing, of the forest surrounding it. Jennifer walked the perimeter, taking notes, clearly moved by the isolation and simplicity of the place. Clara unlocked the cabin door and stepped back, letting Elizabeth enter first. The others followed slowly, reverently, as if entering a sacred space. In many ways, Clara thought, that's exactly what this was, a shrine to love and sacrifice. Elizabeth moved through the small space, touching everything, the cot where Daniel had slept, the stove where he'd cooked simple meals, the shelves where he'd kept his few possessions. She picked up the copy of Sonnets from the Portuguese and opened it to the inscription Daniel had written. May I photograph that? The photographer asked gently. Elizabeth nodded, holding the book open while he captured the image. Jennifer read the inscription and had to pause to compose herself before continuing her notes. This is one of the most powerful stories I've ever covered, Jennifer said quietly. I've been a journalist for 30 years, and I've never encountered anything like this. The depth of love, the cruelty of what was done to him, to both of you. It's staggering." Pastor Henley stood by the window, looking out at the view of the valley below. "I married Thomas and Elizabeth," he said softly. "I remember thinking at the time that the bride seemed distant, sad. I asked her if she was certain about the marriage, and she assured me she was. I've carried guilt about that ceremony for years, feeling I'd somehow failed her. Now I understand she had no choice." "None at all. You didn't fail her," Elizabeth said firmly. "You were doing your job. The people who failed us were Marcus Garrett and everyone who enabled him. Not you." Clara led them to the vantage point Daniel had used to watch the estate. They stood together, looking down at the Garrett mansion, so far below, but clearly visible. "He stood here," Clara explained. "Watching, keeping vigil, making sure you were all right, even though he could never approach, never speak to you." Elizabeth stared down at her home, the prison she'd lived in for 40 years, and something in her expression shifted. Anger replaced grief, determination replaced sorrow. "People need to understand what men like Marcus Garrett do," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone. "They destroy lives not through violence but through power. They manipulate circumstances so thoroughly that their victims feel they have no choice but to comply. Daniel and we both made the choice to sacrifice our happiness to protect our families. But it wasn't really a choice. It was coercion dressed up as choice," Jennifer wrote frantically. "Would you be comfortable saying that on record? That it was coercion?" "I'm comfortable saying anything that's true," Elizabeth replied. "Marcus Garrett was a monster. A civilized, wealthy, respected monster. But a monster nonetheless. And his son, my husband, was complicit through his silence. The Garrett family built their legacy on the ruins of other people's dreams. And it's time everyone knew it." The photographer continued his work, capturing Elizabeth standing where Daniel had stood, looking down at the life she'd been forced to live. The image, Clara knew, would be powerful. A woman finally understanding the depth of love that had existed just beyond her reach. They spent another hour at the cabin. Elizabeth wanted to see everything, understand everything. She sat on the cot where Daniel had slept and read passages from his journal aloud, her voice breaking repeatedly but pushing forward. She held the pressed flowers, touched the books he'd read, tried to imagine the long days and longer nights of solitude he'd endured. "I want to preserve this place," she said, finally. "Not as a tourist attraction, but as a memorial. A place where people can come to reflect on the cost of love, the cruelty of unchecked power. Can that be done legally? The land, who owns it? It's federal forest land," Clara said. "But there might be a way to get historical protection for the structure." "I can look into it." "Please do," Elizabeth said. "This matters. His life here mattered. His sacrifice mattered. It can't just be lost to time." As they prepared to hike back down, Pastor Henley asked if he might say a few words. They gathered outside the cabin, snow beginning to fall lightly again, and the old pastor spoke. "Lord, we stand here today in the presence of love. Not the easy love of convenience, but the hard love of sacrifice. Daniel Boone gave up everything, his family, his identity, his very life in the world, to protect the woman he loved and the families that would have suffered for their happiness. We ask that his sacrifice not be forgotten, that his love be remembered as an example of what it means to truly put others before self. And we ask for healing for those he left behind, for Elizabeth, who carried grief and loss for 40 years, for Clara, who mourned a brother who was alive but unreachable, for Sarah, who grew up in the shadow of secrets she didn't understand. May this truth, finally told, bring peace to those who need it. Amen." "Amen," they chorused softly. The hike down was quieter, each person lost in their own thoughts. When they finally reached the vehicles, the afternoon sun was slanting low through the trees, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. "When will the story run?" Elizabeth asked Jennifer. "Tomorrow's paper," Jennifer replied. "Front page. And I've already had interest from the Associated Press. This story, it's going to reach far beyond Timber Ridge, Mrs. Garrett. Are you prepared for that?" I am, Elizabeth said without hesitation. I've been silent for 40 years. I can handle people finally listening. They drove back to the estate in companionable silence. When they arrived, they found Thomas's car in the driveway. He'd returned while they were gone. He met them at the door, his face unreadable. "There are people who want to speak with you," he said to Elizabeth. "Lawyers, reporters, others. They've been calling all day. Let them call," Elizabeth said, moving past him into the house. "I'll speak to anyone who wants to hear the truth." Thomas caught her arm gently. She stopped, turned to face him. "I spoke with my lawyers today," he said quietly, "about the foundation you mentioned, using Garrett money to help people trapped by power imbalances. They advised against it, said it would be seen as an admission of wrongdoing, could open us up to lawsuits. And Elizabeth's voice was challenging, and I told them to prepare the paperwork anyway," Thomas said. "You're right. My father was wrong. What he did was inexcusable. I can't change the past, but—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Perhaps I can help ensure the future is different. The foundation will be funded from the family trust." Generously funded. Elizabeth stared at her husband, perhaps seeing him clearly for the first time in their 40-year marriage. "Why?" "Because I'm tired too," Thomas said simply. "Tired of carrying my father's legacy. Tired of pretending everything was fine. Tired of—" His voice dropped. "Tired of seeing the sadness in your eyes every single day and knowing I was part of what caused it." Sarah, watching from across the room, felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness. That would take time if it came at all, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Her father had been trapped too, in his own way. Trapped by expectations, by family loyalty, by the weight of legacy. The foundation will be named the Daniel Boone Memorial Fund, Elizabeth said firmly. And it will be clear why it exists, to help people trapped by power, coercion and circumstance. To give them choices they wouldn't otherwise have. "Agreed," Thomas said. That evening, as the sun set over the Montana mountains, Clara sat with Elizabeth and Sarah in the sitting room. The fire crackled warmly, and for the first time since this journey began, Clara felt something like peace settling over her. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked her mother. "After the story breaks, after everyone knows, what then?" Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the cover of Daniel's journal, which she'd been carrying with her constantly. "As if afraid to let it out of her sight, I think," she said slowly. "I might leave. Not forever, but for a while. I want to see the places Daniel and I talked about visiting. The places we would have gone if we'd had our chance. Oregon, like we planned. Maybe the coast. Maybe further." "I'll come with you," Sarah said immediately. Elizabeth looked at her daughter with such profound gratitude that Clara had to look away to give them privacy in their emotion. "And you?" "Clara?" Elizabeth asked. "What will you do?" Clara thought about her quiet house in the mountains, her solitary walks, the 40 years she'd spent carrying grief. "I think I'll keep walking," she said, "but maybe not alone anymore. I have a feeling my walks are going to be interrupted more often now, by reporters, by people wanting to hear Daniel's story, by—" She smiled at Elizabeth and Sarah. "By new friends who I hope will visit often." "Count on it," Sarah said firmly. They sat together as night fell, 3 women whose lives had been forever changed by a bleeding horse, a hidden cabin, and a journal full of love that had refused to die despite decades of separation. Tomorrow the story would break. Tomorrow the world would know what had happened to Daniel Boone and Elizabeth Garrett. Tomorrow there would be questions, interviews, perhaps controversy. But tonight they simply sat together, honoring a love that had endured impossible circumstances and a sacrifice that deserved to be remembered. In the mountains beyond the estate walls, snow continued to fall softly over the cabin where Daniel had lived his exile. The forest kept its vigil, as it had for all those years, sheltering the memory of a man who'd loved so deeply he'd given up everything. His story would live now. His love would be remembered, and that, Clara thought, was exactly what he would have wanted. The morning the story broke, Clara was back at her own homestead. She'd returned the night before, needing the familiar comfort of her own walls, her own bed, the quiet that had sustained her for so many years. But when she drove into town just after dawn to pick up the newspaper, she found she wasn't alone in wanting to see it first thing. Old Sam's store had a crowd gathered outside, even though it was barely 6 in the morning. People stood in small clusters, newspapers open, voices rising and falling in waves of shock and sympathy and anger. When Clara pulled up, several heads turned her way. Sam came out of the store carrying a stack of papers. When he saw Clara, his weathered face broke into something between a smile and tears. He walked directly to her and, to her surprise, pulled her into a tight hug. "Clara Boone," he said, his voice rough. "I had no idea. All these years, I had no idea what your brother did, what he gave up. I'm so sorry." Others approached then. People Clara had known her whole life, but had kept at arm's length for 4 decades. They surrounded her with gentle words and kind touches, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara didn't feel alone in her grief. The front page of the Timber Ridge Gazette carried a photograph that took Clara's breath away. Elizabeth standing at Daniel's vantage point, looking down at the Garrett estate, her face a portrait of love and loss and profound sadness. The headline read, "A love story buried, how one family's power destroyed 2 lives." Jennifer Morrison's article was comprehensive and unflinching. She laid out the entire story: Daniel and Elizabeth's secret romance, Marcus Garrett's ultimatum, Daniel's exile, the decades Elizabeth had spent believing he was dead. She quoted extensively from the journal, letting Daniel's own words tell the story of his sacrifice. She included Pastor Henley's memories of Daniel as a young man, Clara's account of finding the cabin, and Elizabeth's statement about coercion and power. But it was the sidebar that hit hardest, a piece titled "The Death Certificate That Never Was." Jennifer had done her research, discovering that the document Marcus Garrett had shown Elizabeth was a forgery. The county coroner had never signed any such certificate. There had never been a body recovered. The entire story of Daniel's death had been fabricated to ensure Elizabeth would go through with the marriage. "They forged official documents," someone near Clara said, voice shaking with anger. "The Garretts forged a death certificate. That's fraud. That's criminal," another voice finished. Clara stood among the crowd, reading and rereading the article, feeling the weight of 40 years lifting from her shoulders. Daniel's story was out. The truth was known. People understood now what he'd sacrificed, why he'd made the choice he'd made. Ruth appeared at Clara's elbow, tears streaming down her face. "I should have done more," she said. "When I worked at the estate, when I saw how sad Elizabeth was, I should have pushed harder, asked more questions." "You couldn't have known," Clara said, squeezing her friend's hand. "None of us could. That was the genius of what Marcus Garrett did. He made it all look legitimate, made people believe there was tragedy but no crime. But now everyone knows," Ruth said. "Now the Garretts can't hide behind their money and influence." The crowd began to disperse as people headed to work or home, but the conversations continued. Clara could see it spreading, people on phones, texting, sharing the story digitally. By mid-morning, she learned from Sam that the Associated Press had picked it up. By afternoon, it was trending on social media platforms under hashtags like "Justice for Daniel" and "Love and Sacrifice." Clara's phone, which she rarely used, rang constantly. Reporters from national outlets, documentary filmmakers, even a producer from a major streaming service. She declined most of them, referring them to Jennifer Morrison, but she did agree to one interview with a respected national news program. Daniel's story deserved to reach as far as possible. She drove to the Garrett estate late that afternoon, concerned about how Elizabeth was handling the attention. What she found surprised her. The estate's gates were open, and a small crowd had gathered outside. Not protesters exactly, but people bearing flowers, cards, letters. They'd created a makeshift memorial at the gate, with photographs of Daniel that people had found in old yearbooks and family albums, along with messages of support for Elizabeth, for a woman who loved. "Truly," one card read, "your courage inspires us," said. Another, "Daniel's sacrifice won't be forgotten," promised a third. Clara drove through slowly, nodding to people who recognized her. The housekeeper let her in immediately, and she found Elizabeth in the sitting room, surrounded by letters and flowers that had been delivered throughout the day. "I can't keep up," Elizabeth said. But she was smiling, actually smiling, her face more alive than Clara had ever seen it. "People are writing from all over the country. Some are sharing their own stories of being trapped by circumstances, by power imbalances, by families who valued money over happiness. One woman wrote that she left an abusive marriage after reading about Daniel and me, said if we could survive what we survived, she could find the courage to escape. Sarah appeared with tea and more stacks of mail. The foundation is getting donation offers," she reported. "People want to contribute. They want to help make sure others don't face what you and Daniel faced." "Where's Thomas?" Clara asked. "He's been in his study all day," Elizabeth said, "taking calls from lawyers, from business associates, from people in the community. The Garrett name is—" She paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Complicated now. Some people are calling for investigations into the family's business practices, wondering what other secrets might be buried. How do you feel about that?" Elizabeth set down the letter she'd been reading and looked directly at Clara. "I feel free," she said simply. "For the first time in 40 years, I feel like I can breathe. Yes, it's chaotic. Yes, there will be consequences. But I'm not carrying secrets anymore. I'm not pretending. I'm not trapped." The door to the sitting room opened, and Thomas entered. He looked haggard, older somehow, but there was something different in his bearing, less of the rigid pride, more of simple human exhaustion. "There's someone here," he said quietly. "Someone I think you'll want to speak with, Elizabeth." He stepped aside, and an elderly woman entered, leaning on a cane but moving with determination. She had to be in her 80s, with white hair and kind eyes that looked familiar. Elizabeth stood, recognition dawning. "Mrs. Finch?" "Hello, Elizabeth." The woman's voice was warm, but carried decades of regret. "I'm sorry it's taken me so long to come." Elizabeth crossed the room and embraced the woman, her mother, Clara realized. The same mother who'd pushed her into the marriage with Thomas Garrett 40 years ago. "I read the article," Mrs. Finch said when they separated. "I read about Daniel, about what Marcus Garrett did, about," her voice cracked, "about what your father and I did to you. We thought we were protecting you, providing for you. We thought security mattered more than love. We were wrong, Elizabeth. We were so terribly wrong, and I've regretted it every day since." Elizabeth's face was wet with tears. "You didn't know what Marcus would do. You couldn't have known. We should have fought harder," Mrs. Finch interrupted. "When you came to us crying, begging us to let you leave with Daniel, we should have found another way. We should have sold everything, moved away, started over. But we were scared, and we were weak, and we let a powerful man make our decisions for us." She took Elizabeth's hands. "Your father, he died 5 years ago, but before he went, he told me to tell you he was sorry, that he'd been a coward, that you deserved better than what we gave you." "Oh, Mama," Elizabeth whispered, and they held each other while they both cried. Clara quietly excused herself, giving the family privacy. She found Sarah in the hallway, also wiping tears from her eyes. "I never knew my grandmother felt that way," Sarah said. "She's visited maybe 3 times in my entire life. I thought she didn't care." "I think," Clara said gently, "she cared too much. The guilt probably made it impossible to face what she'd done. Sometimes it's easier to stay away than to confront your own failures." They walked outside together, into the garden, where this had all begun just days ago. The November air was cold but clear, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "Everything's changing so fast," Sarah said. "My mother is different, stronger, more present. My father is, I don't even know what my father is. Humbled maybe for the first time in his life. My grandmother shows up after decades of absence. And all because of a bleeding horse and a hidden cabin. All because of love," Clara corrected. "Love that refused to stay buried. Love that demanded to be known." They stood in companionable silence for a moment. Then Sarah asked, "What happens now? After the attention dies down, after the foundation is established, after everything settles, what then?" Clara thought about her quiet house in the mountains, about the walking stick with its 40 notches marking years of solitude. She thought about Daniel's journal, now in Elizabeth's keeping. And about the cabin that would soon be preserved as a memorial, I think, Clara said slowly. We learn to live with joy instead of grief. We honor Daniel not just by telling his story, but by living the kind of lives he would have wanted for us. Connected, purposeful, full of the love he sacrificed everything for. That sounds like a good plan, Sarah said. Inside the house, through the lit windows, they could see Elizabeth and her mother still talking. 40 years of distance finally being bridged. Thomas sat nearby, silent but present, perhaps understanding for the first time what his family's legacy had truly cost. Tomorrow there would be more interviews, more attention, more people reaching out with their own stories of love and sacrifice and survival. But tonight, there was simply this, a family beginning to heal, a truth finally told, and the memory of a man who'd loved so deeply he'd become a ghost to protect it. Clara looked up at the mountains, dark against the star-filled sky, and she could almost feel Daniel's presence, not in sadness or grief, but in something like peace. His story was known now. His love was honored. His sacrifice had meaning beyond the silent years he'd spent alone. Thank you, she whispered to the mountains, to her brother, to the love that had refused to die. Thank you for showing us what matters. And in the quiet of the evening, with snow beginning to fall again over Montana, it felt like the mountains whispered back, "You're welcome." Now live, 3 weeks after the story broke, Clara led a small group back to Daniel's cabin for the last time before it would be officially designated a protected historical site. The group included Elizabeth, Sarah, Pastor Henley, Ruth, Old Sam, and a representative from the Montana Historical Society, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Chen, who specialized in preserving sites of cultural significance. The trail was easier this time, partly because they'd made the hike multiple times now, partly because the weather had held cold but clear. Elizabeth moved with more confidence than she had on that first journey, her body remembering the paths, her spirit lighter than it had been in decades. When they reached the clearing, Margaret Chen spent 20 minutes examining the cabin's construction, taking measurements, photographing details. Finally, she turned to the group with a satisfied nod. "This is remarkable preservation," she said. "The construction technique, the materials, the way it's been naturally protected by the forest, this cabin could stand another 50 years with minimal intervention. It's perfect for what you're proposing." "Which is what exactly?" Sam asked. He'd been mostly quiet during the hike, but Clara could see him taking everything in, processing the enormity of what Daniel had built and lived in. "A memorial site," Elizabeth explained. "Protected but accessible to those who make the journey. Not commercialized, not turned into a tourist attraction, but preserved as a place of reflection. We're calling it the Daniel Boone Memorial Cabin. A monument to love, sacrifice, and the cost of unchecked power. There will be a small plaque," Sarah added, "telling Daniel's story, and a guest book inside where visitors can leave their thoughts, share their own stories if they wish." Margaret nodded. "We'll work with the Forest Service to create a maintained trail, nothing paved or intrusive, just marked and safe. And we'll install a small weather station to monitor conditions that might affect the structure. Otherwise, we leave it as it is. A testament to one man's devotion." They entered the cabin together, and Clara watched as each person experienced it in their own way. Sam stood by the wood stove, shaking his head in wonder at how Daniel had survived winters in such a small space. Pastor Henley knelt by the cot, offering a quiet prayer. Ruth examined the books on the shelf, touching their worn spines gently. Elizabeth moved to the window, the same window Daniel had stood at countless times, looking out at the valley and the life he couldn't have. She'd brought something with her, a small wooden box that she'd been carrying in her pack. "I want to leave this here," she said, showing them, "as part of the memorial." Inside the box were items she'd carefully selected, the locket Daniel had kept, returned to the place it had been cherished. Several pressed flowers from the garden she'd walked in for 40 years, where Daniel had watched her from afar. A photograph of them together from that summer of 1985, young and in love. And a letter, Her own words, written to Daniel, saying everything she'd never gotten to say in life. "I wrote to him," Elizabeth explained, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Told him I understood why he did what he did. Told him I never stopped loving him. Told him—" She paused, swallowing hard. "Told him I forgive him for leaving, even though there's nothing to forgive. He saved us all in his way." They helped her place the box on the small shelf near the window, in the spot where Daniel's journal had rested for years. Sarah added something of her own, a letter she'd written to the man who had loved her mother, thanking him for his sacrifice and promising to help her mother live the rest of her life with the freedom and joy he'd wanted for her. "Should we add something to mark this moment?" Pastor Henley suggested. "Something to officially consecrate this as a memorial?" "A guest book," Ruth said suddenly, like Sarah mentioned. "We could start it now, each of us writing something for Daniel, creating the first entries." Margaret produced a leather-bound journal from her pack. She'd thought to bring it, anticipating this moment. She opened it to the first page and offered it to Elizabeth. Elizabeth's hand shook slightly as she took the pen Margaret handed her. She thought for a long moment, then began to write, "Daniel, I am Elizabeth, the woman you loved. I'm 70 years old now, and I've just learned the truth of what you did for me, for us. I spent 40 years mourning you, believing you were dead, never knowing you were so close, watching over me. I want to thank you for your sacrifice, though thank you seems impossibly inadequate for what you gave up. I want to tell you that your love sustained me, even when I didn't know it was still alive. And I want to promise you that I will spend whatever years I have left living with the courage and devotion you showed every day of your exile. You deserved better than what you got, my love. But you got my eternal gratitude and a love that will never die. Rest in peace, knowing your story is told and your sacrifice is honored. Forever yours, Elizabeth." She passed the book to Sarah, who wrote, "Daniel, I never met you, but you shaped my life in ways I'm only now understanding. You loved my mother with a purity I've rarely seen in this world. Because of you, I understand what real love looks like. Not the easy kind, but the hard kind that costs everything and gives anyway. I promise to help my mother live the life you wanted for her. I promise to make sure your story helps others trapped by power and circumstance. And I promise that the foundation bearing your name will do real good in this world. Thank you for showing us what sacrifice means." With profound respect, Sarah, Clara took the book next, her vision blurred with tears. "Daniel, my brother, my friend, the person I thought I knew but didn't really know at all. For 40 years I walked these mountains alone, carrying grief for you. Now I understand that grief was unnecessary. You were alive, you were close, and you were protecting us all. I'm angry that I didn't know, that I couldn't help you, that you suffered alone. But I'm also proud of your courage, your love, your willingness to sacrifice everything for those you cared about. This cabin is now your monument. Your story is now known. Your love is now honored. I miss you every day, but I don't grieve anymore. I celebrate what you did and who you were. Rest well, little brother. You earned it." Your sister, Clara. One by one, the others added their words. Pastor Henley's blessing. Sam's memory of Daniel as a young man. Ruth's promise to tell his story to her students. Margaret's commitment to preserving his legacy. When the last entry was written, they placed the guest book on the small table by the window, open to the first page, so future visitors would see Elizabeth's words first. The words of the woman Daniel had loved enough to die to the world for. They stood together in silence. 7 people who'd been brought together by a story of love and sacrifice, united in their commitment to make sure it mattered. "There's one more thing," Elizabeth said quietly. She pulled out a small envelope from her coat pocket. "I found this yesterday, going through some old things. It's a letter my mother gave me. She said she'd kept it hidden for 40 years. Afraid to give it to me, because it proved she'd known something was wrong with my marriage from the start." She opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. Folded and refolded so many times, the creases were nearly torn through. She unfolded it gently and began to read. "My dearest Elizabeth, If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've finally learned the truth. I should have fought harder for you. I should have told Marcus Garrett where he could put his demands and his threats. I should have chosen my daughter's happiness over financial security. But I was a coward, and I am deeply, profoundly sorry. Your father and I failed you in the most fundamental way parents can fail their children. We sacrificed your future for our comfort. There is no excuse for that. I hope someday you can forgive us, though I don't deserve it. I hope you found some happiness despite what we did. And if that young man, Daniel, if he's still alive somewhere, if there's any chance, I hope you find him. I hope you get the love story you deserve to have. Your mother, who loved you but failed you, Alice Finch. Elizabeth's voice had broken several times during the reading. When she finished, she carefully refolded the letter and added it to the box on the shelf. She wrote this 10 years ago, Elizabeth explained. Kept it hidden, planning to leave it for me in her will. But when the story broke, when she came to see me, she gave it to me directly. She wanted me to know she'd carried the guilt all these years, that she understood what she'd done. Have you forgiven her? Sarah asked gently. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the view Daniel had cherished. I'm working on it, she said finally. Forgiveness is harder than anger, takes more strength than resentment. But yes, I think I'm getting there. She was trapped too in her own way, trapped by fear and circumstance and the belief that security mattered more than love. They sealed the box and placed it reverently on the shelf. It would stay here, protected from the elements, available for future visitors to read and understand the full scope of what had happened. As they prepared to leave, Clara took one last look around the cabin. It felt different now, less like a place of solitude and sorrow, more like a shrine to something powerful and enduring. Daniel's presence was here, would always be here, but it felt peaceful now rather than tragic. Outside, the November sun was bright and cold, making the snow sparkle like diamonds across the clearing. They stood together taking photographs, not for newspapers or publicity, but for themselves. Images to remember this moment, this place, this transition from grief to celebration. What happens next? Sam asked as they began the hike back down. After the cabin is officially protected, after the foundation is running, what then? Then we live, Elizabeth said simply. She was walking beside Clara, their pace matched, their breathing synchronized. We live the lives Daniel wanted for us, fully, honestly, without the weight of secrets or shame. I'm going to travel, Sarah added. My mother and I were going to take that trip to Oregon she and Daniel planned. We're going to see the places they dreamed about together. She deserves to have those experiences, even if it's 40 years late. And I'm going to keep walking, Clara said. But not alone anymore. These mountains, they're not just my refuge now. They're my reminder that love endures, that sacrifice matters, that truth always finds a way to surface. They made their way down the mountain as afternoon shadows lengthened. 7 people who'd been changed by a story that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Behind them, the cabin stood silent and strong, a monument to one man's extraordinary choice and the love that had made it necessary. Daniel Boone's exile was over. His silence was broken. His story was told, and in the telling, something powerful had happened. Not just justice, but healing. Not just exposure, but transformation. Not just an ending, but a beginning. The mountains kept their vigil as they always had, sheltering the memory of a man who'd loved so deeply he'd become a ghost. But now that ghost had a name, a story, a legacy that would touch lives far beyond anything Daniel could have imagined during those long years alone. His sacrifice had meaning. His love was remembered, and that, Clara thought as they reached the trailhead and prepared to return to their lives, was the happy ending Daniel had earned, even if he hadn't lived to see it himself. 6 months later, Clara stood on her front porch, watching the spring sun climb over the eastern peaks. The mountains were green again, alive with new growth after the long winter. Wildflowers dotted the meadow near her house. The same wildflowers Daniel had pressed between the pages of his journal, the same ones Elizabeth had loved as a young woman. So much had changed since that November morning when a bleeding horse had appeared at her door. So much, and yet the mountains remained constant, indifferent to human drama, eternal in their patience. The bleeding horse had never been found, had never been claimed by any owner in the region. Clara had come to think of it as something beyond explanation. A messenger, perhaps, sent by the universe or by Daniel's spirit, or by simple chance to make sure the truth finally came out. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that it had led her to the cabin, to the journal, to the story that had been buried for too long. She heard a car coming up her drive and smiled. Company was a regular occurrence now, no longer the solitary woman who walked alone. She'd become something of a center for people drawn to Daniel's story, to the questions it raised about love and sacrifice and the cost of power. Elizabeth and Sarah emerged from the car, both looking healthy and happy in ways that still sometimes surprised Clara. Elizabeth had gained weight, lost the gaunt look that had haunted her for years. Her hair was cut shorter now, more practical, and she wore comfortable clothes suited for hiking rather than the elegant but restrictive outfits she'd worn during her years at the estate. "Ready?" Elizabeth called out, waving. "Always," Clara replied, grabbing her walking stick, the one marked with 40 notches for years of solitude. And now 6 new marks for the months since everything changed. They'd made this hike together every week since the snow melted, the 3 of them walking to Daniel's cabin, checking on its condition, reading the entries in the guest book that visitors left. The trail was marked now, maintained by the Forest Service, but still challenging enough to keep casual tourists away. Only those serious about making the journey, about understanding what the place represented, made the effort. As they walked, Elizabeth talked about the foundation. The Daniel Boone Memorial Fund had raised over $2 million in its first 6 months, money that was already being put to use, helping people escape situations where power imbalances trapped them. They'd helped 3 women leave abusive marriages, funded legal representation for 2 families fighting wrongful eviction by wealthy landlords, and provided counseling services to dozens of people dealing with trauma from coercive situations. "We got a letter last week," Elizabeth said as they climbed, "from a young man in Wyoming. He'd been trapped in his family's business, threatened with disinheritance if he didn't follow the path his father demanded. He read Daniel's story and realized he didn't have to sacrifice his own happiness for family expectations. He left, started his own business, and he's thriving now. He wrote to thank us, to thank Daniel for showing him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away." "Daniel would have loved that," Clara said softly. Knowing his sacrifice helped others find their own courage. Sarah was quieter than usual during the hike. When Clara asked if she was all right, she smiled. "I'm fine. Just thinking. My mother and I leave for Oregon next week, the trip we've been planning. I'm excited but also a little nervous. It feels significant, you know, doing what she and Daniel never got to do." "It is significant," Clara agreed. "But it's also joyful. That's what Daniel would want, for you both to experience joy, not just commemorate sadness." They reached the cabin as the morning sun broke through the canopy, illuminating the clearing in shades of gold. The structure looked exactly as it had 6 months ago, preserved and protected, a testament to Daniel's skill and care in its construction. Inside, the guest book was nearly full. They'd need to add a second volume soon. Clara flipped through the pages, reading entries from people all over the country who'd made the pilgrimage to this place. "I was trapped by debt and my family's expectations," one entry read. "Daniel's story gave me the courage to file bankruptcy and start over. Thank you. My daughter was in a relationship with a man whose family had power over her career," another wrote. "We helped her leave after reading about Elizabeth and Daniel. She's safe now and rebuilding her life. This place reminds me that love is worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible," a third entry declared. Page after page of people touched by Daniel's story, inspired by his sacrifice, finding their own courage in his example. Clara felt her eyes sting with tears, good tears this time, tears of gratitude rather than grief. Elizabeth added her own entry as she did every visit. 6 months since the truth came out. 6 months of living freely for the first time in 40 years. Next week, Sarah and I leave for Oregon, following the dream Daniel and I shared. I carry him with me in everything I do now, not as a weight of grief, but as a reminder of what real love looks like. Thank you, my darling, for your sacrifice. I'm finally living the life you wanted for me. They sat together on the steps of the cabin, eating the lunch they'd packed, talking about small things and large, the weather, Sarah's plans to return to Montana permanently after the Oregon trip, the documentary crew that wanted to film at the cabin next month. The Historical Society asked if we'd be willing to donate Daniel's original journal to their archives, Elizabeth said. They'd preserve it, make it available for researchers, scan it for digital access. What do you think, Clara? It was your brother's. You have as much right to decide as I do. Clara considered it carefully. The journal had been in Elizabeth's keeping for 6 months now, but she'd read it so many times she'd nearly memorized it. I think Daniel would want it preserved and shared, she said finally. He wrote it hoping someone would find it someday, hoping the truth would come out. Making it available to everyone seems like honoring that wish. Then we'll do it, Elizabeth agreed. We'll donate it with the condition that it's handled respectfully, that people understand what it represents. As they prepared to hike back down, Ruth appeared on the trail coming up. She'd started joining them regularly, finding peace in the walks and in the companionship of women who understood complicated grief. There's someone at your house. Clara, Ruth said, slightly breathless from the climb. A man named Robert Chen. He says he was Daniel's friend from the army, the one who was going to give him work in Oregon. He saw the news stories and drove all the way from Washington to meet you. Clara's heart leaped. Someone who'd known Daniel before, who'd been part of the plan that never came to fruition. How did he seem? Emotional, Ruth said. He kept saying he should have looked harder, should have questioned what happened when Daniel never showed up. They made their way down quickly, Clara's mind racing. Another piece of Daniel's story, another person touched by his life and his loss. Robert Chen was a man in his 70s, Native American with long gray hair pulled back in a neat braid. He stood when Clara approached, his eyes red from crying. "I'm so sorry," were his first words. "I should have known something was wrong. When Daniel didn't show up in Oregon, when I couldn't reach him, I should have investigated. I should have come looking." "You couldn't have known," Clara said gently, inviting him to sit. "No one knew. That was the whole point of what Marcus Garrett did. He made sure no one would question the official story." Robert shook his head. "Daniel and I served together. We were close. I knew him, knew he'd never just disappear without word. But I let myself believe the story about him getting lost in the mountains. I let myself accept it because questioning it would have been hard, would have required me to do more than I was willing to do." He looked at Clara with eyes full of decades of regret. "I failed him." "No," Elizabeth said firmly, having joined them on the porch. "I'm Elizabeth Garrett, the woman Daniel loved, and I'm telling you, you didn't fail him. The people who failed Daniel were Marcus Garrett and everyone who enabled his cruelty. You were his friend. You offered him a future. You gave him hope when he needed it." "That's not failure." Robert's face crumpled. "He talked about you. Before, when we were deployed, during long nights when we'd share stories about home. He talked about a girl he'd fallen in love with, said she was smart and beautiful and trapped in circumstances she didn't deserve. He said he was going to save her, give her the life she deserved." He looked at Elizabeth. "I'm sorry he didn't get to. I'm sorry you both lost so much." "We did lose," Elizabeth acknowledged. "But we're finding what we can now. Daniel's story is helping people. His sacrifice means something beyond the pain it caused." They spent the afternoon with Robert, sharing stories of Daniel. Robert told them about Daniel's time in the army, about his courage and kindness, about the night he'd saved Robert's life during a training accident. He showed them photographs he'd kept. Men in uniform, Daniel among them, smiling and strong and full of life. "He was one of the best men I've ever known," Robert said. "I want to contribute to the foundation if that's possible. I have some savings and," his voice cracked, "I need to do something to honor him. I need to make up for not looking harder when he disappeared. You don't need to make up for anything, Clara said. But if you want to contribute, the foundation will put it to good use. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and pink, they all sat together on Clara's porch. Clara, Elizabeth, Sarah, Ruth, and Robert. 5 people brought together by one man's extraordinary choice, united in their commitment to make sure his story mattered. I've been thinking, Clara said as twilight deepened, about that horse. The one that led me to the cabin. I never found its owner, never discovered where it came from or where it went. Maybe it was an angel, Ruth suggested with a small smile. Daniel's way of making sure the truth came out. Maybe it was just a horse, Sarah countered. Lost and injured, wandering through the forest, happening to find Clara by pure chance. Does it matter which? Elizabeth asked. Whether it was divine intervention or random chance, the result was the same. The truth came out. Daniel's story was told. Lives were changed. Clara thought about that. About mystery and meaning. About whether the universe conspired to reveal truth, or whether humans simply found patterns in chaos. In the end, she decided Elizabeth was right. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Daniel's sacrifice had not been in vain. What mattered was that love, even love that existed in silence and exile, had power to transform. What mattered was that people all over the country were finding courage in a story that had been buried for 40 years. I'm going to stay in Montana, Robert announced suddenly. I've been alone too long, living with regret. I want to be part of what you're all building here. The foundation, the memorial, the community that's forming around Daniel's story. If you'll have me, of course we'll have you, Clara said immediately. Daniel would have wanted his friend nearby. As night fell fully over the mountains, they sat together in comfortable silence. Tomorrow, Elizabeth and Sarah would continue their preparations for Oregon. Ruth would return to her students and her garden. Robert would begin the process of relocating to Montana. And Clara would wake early, make her coffee, and take her daily walk through the mountains she'd never stopped loving. But tonight, they simply sat together. A family not of blood, but of shared story. Of common purpose, of love that had survived everything thrown at it. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. The mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping their vigil as they always had. And somewhere in those mountains, in a cabin carefully preserved, Daniel Boone's story waited to be discovered by the next person who needed to hear it. The next soul who needed to understand that love, real love. The kind that costs everything was always worth it. Clara closed her eyes and felt the evening breeze on her face. She thought about the 40 years she'd spent walking alone, carrying grief that had shaped her life. She thought about the brother she'd lost and found again, not in body but in story and spirit. And she thought about how a single act of courage, a single choice to protect rather than possess, to sacrifice rather than surrender, had rippled forward through decades, changing lives Daniel would never meet, inspiring people he would never know. Some losses never truly heal, she thought, remembering the words that had opened this journey. But some losses transform into something else, into wisdom, into strength, into stories that matter long after the pain has faded. She opened her eyes and looked at the people gathered on her porch. These friends who had become family, and she smiled. Daniel would have loved this, she said softly. He would have loved knowing that his story brought people together instead of tearing them apart, that his sacrifice created community instead of just causing pain. He did love it, Elizabeth said with quiet certainty. Wherever he is, whatever comes after this life, he knows, he sees, and he's at peace. Clara thought about that as the stars emerged one by one over the Montana sky. She thought about belief and hope and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of loss, and she decided that yes, Elizabeth was right. Daniel knew. Somehow, in some way, he understood that his exile had ended not in silence, but in song. Not in forgetting, but in remembering. Not in defeat, but in the kind of victory that changes the world quietly. One person at a time, the mountains kept their secrets and told their truths. The forest sheltered both the living and the memory of the dead, and a bleeding horse, wherever it had come from and wherever it had gone, had delivered a message 40 years in the making. Love endures. Truth surfaces, and sacrifice, when made for the right reasons, transforms everything it touches. That was Daniel's legacy. That was the story that would outlive them all. And standing on her porch, surrounded by family chosen rather than given, Clara Boone finally understood what her brother had known all along, that some things are worth giving up everything for. Love was one of them. Truth was another, and both, in the end, had won.